All right, everybody. How are we doing this morning, evening, wherever you are? So, Spirit told me to pause with what were we doing? The prostitution thing. Okay, we get the point. So, um, men have, men and women have created this system of prostitution, both beta males and beta females, because they do not embody the God and the goddess. So they have to emulate in whatever way that they can by stealing the womb energy of the woman and the phallic energy of the male. So we're just going to go back over when God was a woman, because it was my content was stolen the first time I did it 4 years ago. So we're just going to go back over the first three chapters. You can watch the rest of it on the channel. I'll put it in a one folder so you can watch it all at the same time. All right, so let's get into it. So this is When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone. The story of the most ancient of religions, the religion of the goddess, and the role this ancient worship played in Judeo Christian attitudes towards women. In his statement opposed to the ordination of women, Bishop C. L. Myers said the Episcopalian priesthood is a masculine conception. A priest is a God symbol, whether he likes it or not. In the imagery of both the Old and New Testament, God is represented in masculine imagery. He said in a statement that was circulated among some 760 delegates at Grace Cathedral for the two and a half day convention. Christ is the source of priesthood. The sexuality of Christ is no accident, nor is his masculinity incidental. This is the divine choice, the statement said, from the San Francisco Chronicle of October 25th, 1971. How did it actually happen? How did men initially gain the control that now allows them to regulate the world in matters as vastly diverse and deciding which wars will be fought, when to what time dinner should be served? This book is the result of my reactions to these and similar questions, which many of us concerned about the status of women in our society have been asking ourselves and each other. As if in answer to our queries, yet another question presented itself. What else might we expect in a society that for centuries has taught young children, both female and male, that a male deity created the universe and all that is in it, produced man in his own divine image, and then, as an afterthought, created a woman to obediently help man in his endeavors? The image of Eve, created for her husband, from her husband, the woman who was supposed to have brought about the downfall of humankind, has in many ways become the image of all women. How did this idea ever come into being? Few people who live in societies where Christianity, Judaism, or Islam are followed remain unaware of the tale of Eve heeding the word of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, eating the forbidden fruit and then tempting Adam to do the same. Generally, during the most impressionable years of childhood, We are taught that it was this act of eating the tasty fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that caused the loss of paradise, the expulsion of Adam and Eve, thus all humankind, from this first home of bliss and contentment. We are also made to understand that as a result of this act, it was decreed by God that woman must submit to the dominance of man, who was at that time divinely presented with the right to rule over her from that moment until now. The expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden is not exactly the latest news, but few contemporary happenings have affected women of today and more directly. In the struggle to achieve equal status for women in a society still permeated by the values and moralities of Judeo Christian beliefs, which have penetrated deeply into even the most secular aspects of our contemporary civilization, we soon realized that a thorough examination of this creation legend, alongside its historical origins, provides us with vital information. It allows us to comprehend the role that contemporary religions have played in the initial and continual oppression and subjugation of women, and the reasons for this. In prehistoric and early historic periods of human development, religions existed in which people revered their supreme creator as female. The great goddess, the divine ancestress, had been worshipped from the beginnings of the Neolithic periods of 7000 BC until the closing of the last goddess temples about AD 500. Some authorities would extend goddess worship as far into the past as the Upper Paleolithic age of about 25,000 BC. Yet events of the Bible, which we are generally taught to think of as taking place in the beginning of time, actually occurred in historic periods. Abraham, first prophet of the Hebrew Christian God Yahweh, more familiarly known as Jehovah, is believed by most Bible scholars to have lived no earlier than 1800 BC and possibly as late as 1550 BC. Most significant is the realization that for thousands of years, both religions existed simultaneously among closely neighboring peoples. Archaeological, mythological, and historical evidence all reveal that the female religion, far from naturally fading away, was the victim of centuries of continual persecution and suppression by the advocates of the newer religions, which held male deities as supreme. And from these new religions came the creation myth of Adam and Eve and the tale of the loss of paradise. What had life been like for women who lived in a society that venerated a wise and valiant female creator? Why had the members of the later male religions fought so aggressively to suppress that earlier worship, even the very memory of it? What did the legend of Adam and Eve really signify, and when and why was it written? The answers I discovered have formed the contents of this book, When God Was a Woman. The story of the suppression of women's rights has been written to explain the historical events and political attitudes that led to the writing of the Judeo Christian myth of the fall, the loss of paradise, and most important, why the blame for that loss was attributed to the woman Eve and has ever since been placed heavily upon all women. Though to many of us today, religion appears to be an archaic relic of the past, especially the writings of the Old Testament, which tell of times many centuries before the birth of Christ, to many of our parents, grandparents, or great grandparents, these writings were still regarded as the sacred gospel, the divine word. In turn, their religious beliefs and subsequent behavior and social patterns have left their imprint on us in various ways. Indeed, the ancient past is not so far removed as we might imagine or prefer to believe. In fact, if we are ever to fully understand how and why man gained the image of the one who accomplishes the greatest and most important deeds, while woman was relegated to the role of ever patient helper, and subsequently assured that this was the natural state of female male relationships, It is to these remote periods of human history that we must travel. It is the ancient origins of human civilizations and the initial development of religious patterns we must explore, and this, as you will see, is no easy task. It is shocking to realize how little has been written about female deities who were worshipped in the most ancient periods of human existence, and exasperating to then confront the fact that even the material there is has been almost totally ignored in popular literature and general education. Most of the information and artifacts concerning the vast female religion, which flourished for thousands of years before the advent of Judaism, Christianity, and the classical age of Greece, have been dug out of the ground only to be reburied in obscure archaeological texts carefully shelved away in the exclusively protected stacks of university and museum libraries. Quite a few of these were accessible only with the proof of university affiliation or university degree. Many years ago, I set out upon a quest. It eventually led me halfway round the world from San Francisco to Beirut. I wanted to know more about the ancient religion. Along the way were the libraries, museums, universities, and excavation sites of the United States, Europe, and the Near East. Making my way from place to place, I compiled information from a vast variety of sources, patiently gleaning each title, each little phrase, prayer, or fragment of a legend from a myriad of diverse information. As I gathered this material about the early female deities, I found that many ancient legends had been used as ritual dramas. These were enacted at religious ceremonies of sacred festivals, coinciding with other ritual activities. Statues, murals, inscriptions, clay tablets, and papyri that recorded events, legends, and prayers revealed the form and attitudes of the religion and the nature of the deity. Comments were often found in the literature of one country about the religion or divinities of another. Most interesting was the realization that the myths of each culture that explained their origins were not always the oldest. Newer versions often superseded and displaced previous ones, while solemnly declaring that this is as it was in the beginning of time. Professor Edward Shiera of the University of Chicago wrote of the Babylonian myth of the creation of heaven and earth by the god Marduk, that Marduk, the new god of this rather new city, certainly had no right to appropriate to himself the glory of so great a deed. But in Hammurabi's time, Babylon was the center of the kingdom. Marduk, backed by Hammurabi's armies, could now claim to be the most important god in the land. Professor Chayera also explained that in Assyria, where the god Ashur eventually became the supreme deity, the Assyrian priest gave the honor to Ashur simply by taking the old Babylonian tablets and recopying them, substituting the name of their own god for that of Marduk. The work was not very carefully done, and in some places the name of Marduk still creeps in. In the difficulties I encountered gathering material, I could not help thinking of the ancient writing and statuary that must have been intentionally destroyed. Accounts of the antagonistic attitudes of Judaism, Christianity, and Mohammedanism or Islam toward the sacred artifacts of the religions that preceded them revealed that this was so, especially in the case of the goddess worshipped in Canaan or Palestine. The bloody massacres, the demolition of statues or pagan idols and sanctuaries are recorded in the pages of the Bible following this command by Yahweh. You must completely destroy all the places where the nations you dispossess have served their gods on high mountains, on hills, under any spreading tree. You must tear down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred poles, set fire to the carved images of their gods, and wipe out their name from that place. Deuteronomy 12, verse 2 and 3. There can be little doubt that the continuous attacks, as recorded in the Old Testament, destroyed much precious and irretrievable information. In later periods, Christians were known throughout the world for their destruction of sacred icons and literature belonging to the so called pagan or heathen religions. Professor George Milanus wrote that during the reign of the early Christian emperor Theodosius, the Christians, especially in the large cities of Antioch and Alexandria, became the persecutors and the pagans the persecuted. Temples and idols were destroyed by fire and their devotees mistreated, as the worship of the earlier deities was suppressed and the temples destroyed, closed, or converted into Christian churches. As so often happened, statues and historic records were obliterated by the missionary fathers of Christianity as well. Though the destruction was major, it was not total. Fortunately, many objects had been overlooked, remnants that today tell their own version of the nature of those dread pagan rituals and beliefs. Just a quick note, I do not believe everything in this book. I will put in my comments when needed. So, though the destruction was major, it was not total. Fortunately, many objects had been overlooked, remnants that today tell their own version of the nature of those dread pagan rituals and beliefs. The enormous number of goddess figurines that have been unearthed in excavations of the Neolithic and early historic periods of the Near and Middle East suggests that it may well have been the evident female attributes of nearly all of these statues that irked the advocates of the male deity. Most pagan idols had breasts. The writers of the Judeo Christian Bible, as we know it, seem to have purposely glossed over the sexual identity of the female deity who was held sacred by the neighbors of the Hebrews in Canaan, Babylon, and Egypt. The Old Testament does not even have a word for goddess. In the Bible, the goddess is referred to as Elohim in the masculine gender, to be translated as God. But the Quran of the Mohammedans was quite clear. In it, we read, Allah will not tolerate idolatry. The pagans pray to females. Since a great deal of information was gleaned from university and museum libraries, another problem I encountered was the sexual and religious bias of many of the erudite scholars of the 19th and 20th centuries. Most of the available information in both archaeology and ancient religious history was compiled and discussed by male authors. The overwhelming prevalence of male scholars and the fact that nearly all archaeologists, historians, and theologians of both sexes were raised in societies that embraced the male oriented religions of Judaism or Christianity appeared to influence heavily what was included and expanded upon and what was considered to be minor and hardly worth mentioning. Professor R.K. Harrison wrote of the goddess religion. One of its most prominent features was the lewd, depraved, orgiastic character of its cultic procedures. Despite the discovery of temples of the goddess in nearly every Neolithic and historic excavation, Werner Keller writes that the female deity was worshipped primarily on hills and knolls, simply echoing the words of the Old Testament. Professor W. F. Albright, one of the leading authorities on the archaeology of Palestine, wrote of the female religion as orgiastic nature worship, sensuous nudity, and gross mythology. He continued by saying that it was replaced by Israel with its pastoral simplicity and purity of life, its lofty monotheism, and its severe code of ethics. It is difficult to understand how these words can be academically justified after reading of the massacres perpetrated by the Hebrews on the original inhabitants of Canaan as portrayed in the book of Joshua, especially chapters 9 to 11. Professor S.H. Hook, in his collection of essays, Myth, Ritual, and Kingship, openly admits, "I firmly believe that God chose Israel to be the vehicle of revelation." Albright himself wrote, "It is frequently said that the scientific quality of Palestinian archaeology has been seriously impaired by the religious preconceptions of scholars who have excavated in the Holy Land. It is true that some archaeologists have been drawn to Palestine by their interest in the Bible, and that some of them had received their previous training mainly as biblical scholars." But he then proceeded to reject this possibility of impairment, basing his conclusion primarily upon the fact that the dates assigned to the sites and artifacts of ancient Palestine by the scholars who took part in the earlier excavations were subsequently proven to be too recent rather than too old, as might perhaps be expected. The question of whether or not the attitudes and beliefs inherent in those suggested religious preconceptions had perhaps subtly influenced analysis and descriptions of the symbolism, rituals, and general nature of the ancient religion was not even raised for discussion. In most archaeological texts, the female religion is referred to as a fertility cult, perhaps revealing the attitudes towards sexuality held by the various contemporary religions that may have influenced the writers. But archaeological and mythological evidence of the veneration of the female deity as creator and lawmaker of the universe, prophetess, provider of human destinies, inventor, healer, hunter, and valiant leader in battle, suggests that the title fertility cult may be a gross oversimplification of a complex theological structure. Paying closer attention to semantics, subtle linguistic undertones, and shades of meaning, I noticed that the word cult, which has the implicit connotations of something less fine or civilized than religion, was nearly always applied to the worship of the female deities, not by ministers of the church, but by presumably objective archaeologists and historians. The rituals associated with the Judeo Christian Yahweh or Jehovah were always respectively described by these same scholars as religion. It was upon seeing the words God and even He each time carefully begun with capital letters, while Queen of Heaven, Goddess, and She were most often written in lowercase, that I decided to try it the other way about, observing how these seemingly minor changes subtly affected the meaning as well as the emotional impact. Within descriptions of long buried cities and temples, academic authors wrote of the sexually active goddess as improper, unbearably aggressive, or embarrassingly void of morals, while male deities who raped or seduced legendary women or nymphs were described as playful, even admirably virile. The overt sexual nature of the goddess, juxtaposed to her sacred divinity, so confused one scholar that he finally settled for the perplexing title, the Virgin Harlot. The women who followed the ancient sexual customs of the goddess faith, known in their own language as sacred or holy women, were repeatedly referred to as ritual prostitutes. This choice of words once again reveals a rather ethnocentric ethic, probably based on biblical attitudes. Yet, using the term prostitute as a translation for the title of women who were actually known as Kadesh, meaning holy, suggests a lack of comprehension of the very theological and social structure the writers were attempting to describe and explain. Descriptions of the female deity as creator of the universe, inventor, or provider of culture were often given only a line or two, if mentioned at all. Scholars quickly disposed of these aspects of the female deity as hardly worth discussing. And despite the fact that the title of goddess in most historical documents of the Near East was the Queen of Heaven. Some writers were willing to know her only as the eternal Earth Mother. The female divinity revered as warrior or hunter, courageous soldier, or agile markswoman was sometimes described as possessing the most curiously masculine attributes. The implication being that her strength and valor made her something of a freak or physiological abnormality. J. Meringer, professor of prehistoric archaeology, rejected the idea that reindeer skulls were the hunting trophies of a Paleolithic tribe. The reason they were found in the grave of a woman. He writes, here the skeleton was that of a woman, a circumstance that would seem to rule out the possibility that reindeer skulls and antlers were hunting trophies. Might these authors be judging the inherent physical nature of women by the fragile, willowy ideals of today's Western fashions? Priestesses of the goddess who provided the counsel and advice at her shrines of prophetic wisdom were described as being fit for the position, since as women they were more intuitive or emotional, thus ideal mediums for divine revelation. These same writers generally disregarded the political importance of the advice given or the possibility that these women might, in fact, have been respected as wise and knowledgeable, capable of holding vital advisory positions. Strangely enough, emotional qualities or intuitive powers were never mentioned in connection with the male prophets of Yahweh. Gerard von Rod commented, it has always been the women who have shown an inclination for obscure astrological cults. The word gods, in preference to the word deities, when both female and male deities were discussed, was most often chosen by the contemporary scribes of ancient religion. Conflicting translations, even something as simple as drivers. He did sweep from the fields the women gathering sticks, to graze to and fro in the fields plied the women cutting wood, raised questions about the accuracy of the use of certain words chosen as translations. It is true that ancient languages are often quite difficult to decipher and to then translate into contemporary words and terms. In some in some cases, a certain amount of educated guessing takes place, and this is temporarily useful, but it is here that preconceived attitudes may be likely to surface. Unfortunately, instances of possibly inaccurate translation, biased comments, assumptions, and speculations innocently blend into explanations of attitudes and beliefs of ancient times. Male bias, together with preconceived religious attitudes, which appears in both major and minor matters, raises some very pressing and pertinent questions concerning the objectivity of the analysis of the archaeological and historical material available at present. It suggests that long accepted theories and conclusions must be re examined, re evaluated, and, where indicated by the actual evidence, revised. In 1961, a series of mistakes was described by Professor Walter Emery, who took part in the excavations of some of the earliest Egyptian tombs. He tells us that the chronological position and status of Meriet Nit is uncertain, but there is reason to suppose that she might be the successor of Zer and the third sovereign of the first dynasty. Writing of the excavation of this tomb by Sir Flinders Petrie in 1900, he says, at that time it was believed that Meriet Nit was a king, but later research has shown the name to be that of a woman, and, to judge by the richness of the burial, a queen. He goes on to say, in 1896, De Morgan, then director of the Service of Antiquities, discovered at Nagada a gigantic tomb which, from the objects found in it, was identified as the burial place of Hor Aha, first king of the first dynasty. However, later research has shown that it is more probable that it was the sepulcher of Nithotep, Hor-Ah's mother. And again, he tells us that on the mace of Narmer, a seated figure in a canopied palanquin was once thought to be that of a man, but a comparison of similar figures on a wooden label from Saqqara shows that this is improbable and that it almost certainly represents a woman. Yet, despite his own accounts of this series of assumptions, that the richest burials and royal palanquins of the past were for men rather than women. In describing the tomb of King Narmer, he then states this monument is almost insignificant in comparison with the tomb of Nithotep at Nagada, and we can only conclude that this was only the king's southern tomb and that his real burial place still awaits discovery. Though some pharaohs did build two tombs, one might expect a possibly or probably rather than such an absolute conclusion and the implied dismissal of the possibility that in that period of earliest dynastic Egypt, a queen's tomb just might have been larger and more richly decorated than a king's. In Palestine before the Hebrews, E. Anadi described a group of Asiatics arriving in Egypt. In this description, he explains that it is the men who have arrived, and with them they bring their goods and their donkeys, their wives and children, tools, weapons, and musical instruments in that order. Anadi's description of the earliest appearance of the goddess is no less male oriented. He writes, these Upper Paleolithic men also created a feminine figure, apparently representing a goddess or being of fertility. The psychological implications of the mother goddess are therefore of tremendous importance. Here, undeniably, is the picture of a thinking man, of a man with intellectual as well as material achievements. Could it possibly have been the female ancestors of those women who are listed along with the donkeys and other goods who were thinking women, women with intellectual as well as material achievements? Dr. Margaret Murray of the University of London, writing on ancient Egypt in 1949, suggested that the whole series of events surrounding the romantic relationships of Cleopatra, who actually held the legitimate right to the Egyptian throne, was misunderstood as the result of male bias. She points out that the classical historians, imbued as they were with the customs of patrilineal descent and monogamy, besides looking on women as the chattels of their menfolk, completely misunderstood the situation and have misinterpreted it to the world. These are just a few examples of the sexual and religious biases that I encountered. As Cyrus Gordon, professor of Near Eastern Studies and formerly chairman of the department at Brandeis University in Massachusetts, writes, we absorb attitudes as well as subject matter in the learning process. Moreover, the attitudes tend to determine what we see and what we fail to see in the subject matter. This is why attitude is just as important as subject matter in the educational process. Many questions come to mind. How influenced by contemporary religions were many of the scholars who wrote the text available today? How many scholars have simply assumed that males have always played the dominant role in leadership and creative invention and projected this assumption into their analysis of ancient cultures? Why do so many people educated in this century think of classical Greece as the first major culture when written language was in use in great cities built at least 25 centuries before that time? And perhaps most important, why is it continually inferred that the age of the pagan religions, the time of the worship of female deities, if mentioned at all, was dark and chaotic, mysterious and evil, without the light of order and reason that supposedly accompanied the later male religions, when it has been archaeologically confirmed that the earliest law, government, medicine, agriculture, architecture, metallurgy, wheeled vehicles, ceramics, textiles, and written language were initially developed in societies that worshiped the goddess. We may find ourselves wondering about the reasons for the lack of easily available information on societies who, for thousands of years, worshiped the ancient creatress of the universe. Despite the many obstacles, I sought out and gathered the existing information and began to collate and correlate what I had collected. As I understood this process, the importance, the longevity, and the complexity of this past religion began to take form before me. So often there was just the mention of the goddess, a part of a legend, an obscure reference tucked away in some 400 or 500 pages of scholarly erudition, a deserted temple site on Crete, or a statue in the Museum of Istanbul with little or no accompanying information, began to find its place in the overall picture. Painstakingly bringing these together, I finally began to comprehend the total reality. It was more than an inscription of an ancient prayer, more than an art relic sitting on a museum shelf behind glass, more than a grassy field strewn with parts of broken columns or the foundation stones which had once supported an ancient temple. Placed side by side, the pieces of this jigsaw puzzle revealed the overall structure of a geographically vast and major religion, one that had affected the lives of multitudes of people over thousands of years. Just like the religions of today, it was totally integrated into the patterns and laws of society. The morals and attitudes associated with those theological beliefs, probably reaching deep into even the most agnostic or atheistic of minds. I am not suggesting a return or revival of the ancient female religion, as Sheila Collins writes. As women, our hope for fulfillment lies in the present and future and not in some mythical golden past. I do hold the hope, however, that a contemporary consciousness of the once widespread veneration of the female deity as the wise creatress of the universe and all life and civilization may be used to cut through the many oppressive and falsely founded patriarchal images, stereotypes, customs, and laws that were developed as direct reactions worship by the leaders of the later male worshiping religions. For, as I shall explain, it was the ideological inventions of the advocates of the later male deities imposed upon that ancient worship with the intention of destroying it and its customs that are still, through their subsequent absorption into education, law, literature, economics, philosophy, psychology, media, and general social attitudes, imposed upon even the most non religious people of today. This is not intended as an archaeological or historical text. It is rather an invitation to all women to join in the search to find out who we really are by beginning to know our own past heritage as more than a broken and buried fragment of a male culture. We must begin to remove the exclusive mystique from the study of archaeology and ancient religion to explore the past for ourselves rather than remaining dependent upon the interest, interpretations, translations, opinions, and pronouncements that have so far been produced. As we compile the information, we shall be better able to understand and explain the erroneous assumptions in the stereotypes that were initially created for women to accept, follow by the proclamations in the male oriented religions that, according to the divine word, a particular trait was normal or natural, and any deviation improper, unfeminine, or even sinful. It is only as many of the tenets of the Judeo Christian theologies are seen in the light of their political origins and the subsequent absorption of these tenets into secular life understood that as women, we were we will be able to view ourselves as mature, self-determining human beings. With this understanding, we may be able to regard ourselves not as permanent helpers, but as doers, not as decorative and convenient assistants to men, but as responsible and competent individuals in our own right. The image of Eve is not our image of a woman. It is also an invitation to all men, those who have previously questioned the reasons for the roles and images of females and males in contemporary society, and those who had never considered the subject before. It is an invitation extended in the hope that becoming aware of the historical and political origins of the Bible and the role played over the centuries by the Judeo Christian theologies in formulating the attitudes toward women and men today may lead to a greater understanding, cooperation, and mutual respect between women and men than has heretofore been possible. For men interested in achieving this goal, exploring the past offers a deeper and more realistic understanding of today's sexual stereotypes by replacing them in the perspective of their historical evolution. As with every extensive work or study, there are many people who have graciously helped along the way, people to whom I owe much appreciation. Blah, 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 blah. Go to chapter 1. Tales with a point of view. Though we live amid high-rise steel buildings, formica countertops, and electronic television screens, there is something in all of us, women and men alike, that makes us feel deeply connected with the past. Perhaps the sudden dampness of a beach cave or the lines of sunlight piercing through the intricate lace patterns of the leaves in a darkened grove of tall trees will awaken from the hidden recesses of our minds the distant echoes of a remote and ancient time, taking us back to the early stirrings of human life on the planet. For people raised and programmed on the patriarchal religions of today, religions that affect us in even the most secular aspects of our society, perhaps there remains a lingering, almost innate memory of sacred shrines and temples tended by priestesses who served in the religion of the original supreme deity. In the beginning, people prayed to the creatress of life, the mistress of heaven. At the very dawn of religion, God was a woman. Do you remember? For years, something has magnetically lured me into exploring the legends, the temple sites, the statues, and the ancient rituals of the female deities, drawing me back in time to an age when the goddess was omnipotent and women acted as her clergy, controlling the form and rites of religion. Perhaps it was my training and work as a sculptor that first exposed me to the sculptures of the goddess found in the ruins of prehistoric sanctuaries and the earliest dwellings of human beings. Perhaps it was a certain romantic mysticism which once embarrassed me, but to which I now happily confess, that led me over the years into the habit of collecting information about the early female religions and the veneration of female deities. Occasionally, I tried to dismiss my fascination with this subject as overall fanciful and certainly disconnected from my work. I was building electronic sculptural environments at the time. Nevertheless, I would find myself continually pursuing archaeology journals and poring over text in museums or university library stacks. As I read, I recalled that somewhere along the pathway of my life, I had been told and accepted the idea that the sun, great and powerful, was naturally worshipped as male, while the moon, hazy, delicate symbol of sentiment and love, had always been revered as female. Much to my surprise, I discovered accounts of sun goddesses in the lands of Canaan, Anatolia, Arabia, and Australia, while sun goddesses among the Eskimos, the Japanese, and the Khasis of India were accompanied by subordinate brothers who were symbolized as the moon. I had somewhere assimilated the idea that the earth was invariably identified as female, Mother Earth, the one who passively accepts the seed, while heaven was naturally and inherently male, its intangibility symbolic of the supposedly exclusive male ability to think in abstract concepts. This too I had accepted without question until I learned that nearly all the female deities of the Near and Middle East were titled Queen of Heaven. And in Egypt, not only was the ancient goddess Nut known as the heavens, but her brother husband Geb was symbolized as the earth. Most astonishing of all was the discovery of numerous accounts of the female creators of all existence, divinities who were credited women who worshipped a warrior goddess, hunted and fought in the lands of Libya, Anatolia, Bulgaria, Greece, Armenia, and Russia, and were far from the mythical fantasy so many writers of today would have us believe. I could not help noticing how far removed from contemporary images were the prehistoric and most ancient historic attitudes toward the thinking capabilities and intellect of woman, for nearly everywhere the goddess was revered as wise counselor and prophetess. The Celtic Ceridwen was the goddess of intelligence and knowledge in the pre Christian legends of Ireland. The priestesses of the goddess Gaia provided the wisdom of divine revelation at pre Greek sanctuaries, while the Greek Demeter and the Egyptian Isis were both invoked as lawgivers and sage dispensers of righteous wisdom, counsel, and justice. The Egyptian goddess Mayat represented the very order, rhythm, and truth of the universe. Ishtar of Mesopotamia was referred to as the directress of people, the prophetess, the lady of vision, while the archaeological records of the city of Nimrod, where Ishtar was worshipped, revealed that women served as judges and magistrates in the courts of law. The more I read, the more I discovered the worship of female deities appeared in every area of the world, presenting an image of woman that I had never before encountered. As a result, I began to ponder upon the power of myth and eventually to perceive these legends as more than the innocent childlike fables they first appeared to be. They were tales with a most specific point of view. Myths present ideas that guide perception, conditioning us to think and even perceive in a particular way, especially when we are young and impressionable. Often they portray the actions of people who are rewarded or punished for their behavior, and we are encouraged to view these as examples to emulate or avoid. So many of the stories told to us from the time we are just old enough to understand deeply affect our attitudes and comprehension of the world about us and ourselves. Our ethics, morals, conduct, values, sense of duty, and even sense of humor are often developed from simple childhood parables and fables. From them we learn what is socially acceptable in the society from which they come. They define good and bad, right and wrong, what is natural and what is unnatural among the people who hold the myths as meaningful. It was quite apparent that the myths and legends that grew from and were propagated by a religion in which the deity was female and revered as wise, valiant, powerful, and just provided very different images of womanhood from those which we are offered by the male oriented religions of today. A fortnight after the creation of the universe. As I considered the power of myth, it became increasingly difficult to avoid questioning the influential effects that the myths accompanying the religions that worship male deities had upon my own image of what it meant to be born a female, another Eve, progenitress of my childhood faith. As a child, I was told that Eve had been made from Adam's rib, brought into being to be his companion and helpmate, to keep him from being lonely. As if this assignment of permanent second mate, never to be captain, was not oppressive enough to my future plans as a developing member of society. I next learned that Eve was considered to be foolishly gullible. My elders explained that she had been easily tricked by the promises of the perfidious serpent. She defied God and provoked Adam to do the same, thus ruining a good thing, the previously blissful life in the Garden of Eden. Why Adam himself was never thought to be equally as foolish was apparently never worth discussing. But identifying with Eve, who was presented as the symbol of all women, the blame was in some mysterious way mine, and God, viewing the whole affair as my fault, chose to punish me by decreeing, I will greatly multiply your pain and childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. In Genesis 3 and 16. So even as a young girl, I was taught that because of Eve, when I grew up, I was to bear my children in pain and suffering. As if this was not a sufficient penalty, instead of receiving compassion, sympathy, or admiring respect for my courage, I was to experience this pain with guilt. The sin of my wrongdoing laid heavily upon me as punishment for simply being a woman, a daughter of Eve. To make matters worse, I was also supposed to accept the idea that men, as symbolized by Adam, in order to prevent any further foolishness on my part, were presented with the right to control me or to rule over me. According to the omnipotent male deity whose righteousness and wisdom I was expected to admire and respect with a reverent awe, men were far wiser than women. Thus, my penitent, submissive position as a female was firmly established by page 3 of the nearly 1,000 pages of the Judeo Christian Bible. But this original decree of male supremacy was only the beginning. The myth describing Eve's folly was not to be forgotten or ignored. We then studied the words of the prophets of the New Testament, who repeatedly utilized the legend of the loss of paradise to explain and even prove the natural inferiority of women. The lessons learned in the Garden of Eden were impressed upon us over and over again. Man was created first, woman was made for man. Only man was made in God's image. According to the Bible and those who accepted it as the divine word, the male God favored men and had indeed designed them as naturally superior. Even now, I cannot help wondering how many times those passages from the New Testament were read from the authoritative position of a Sunday pulpit or from the family Bible that had been pulled down from the shelf by father or husband and a pious woman listened to. Let the woman learn in silence with all subjection. But I suffer not a woman to teach or to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed and then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 14. For the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Let the women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, so saith the law. And if they learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3, 7, and 9. Strangely enough, I never did become very religious, despite the continual efforts of Sunday school teachers. In fact, by the time I reached adolescence, I had rejected most of what the organized religions had to offer, but there was still something about the myth of Adam and Eve that lingered, seeming to pervade the culture at some deeper level. It appeared and reappeared as the symbolic foundation of poems and novels. It was visually interpreted in oils by the great masters whose paintings glowed from the slide projectors in my art history courses. Products were advertised in high fashion magazines, suggesting that if a woman wore the right perfume, she might be able to pull the whole disaster off all over again. It was even the basis of dull jokes in the Sunday comics. It seemed that everywhere woman was tempting man to do wrong. Our entire society agreed. Adam and Eve defined the images of men and women. Women were inherently conniving, contriving, and dangerously sexy, while gullible and somewhat simple minded at the same time. They were in obvious need of a foreman to keep them in line, and thus divinely appointed. Many men seemed quite willing. As I began to read other myths that explained the creation of life, stories that attributed the event to Nut or Hathor in Egypt, Namu or Ninhursag in Sumer, Mami, Tiamat or Aruru in other parts of Mesopotamia, and Mawu in Africa, I began to view the legend of Adam and Eve as just another fable, an innocent attempt to explain what happened at the very beginning of existence. But it was not long afterward that I began to understand how specifically contrived the details of this particular myth were. In 1960, mythologist Joseph Campbell commented on the Adam and Eve myth in writing, this curious mythological idea and the still more curious fact that for 2,000 years it was accepted throughout the Western world as the absolutely dependable account of an event that was supposed to have taken place about a fortnight after the creation of the universe poses forcefully the highly interesting question of the influence of conspicuously contrived counterfeit mythologies and the inflections of mythology upon the structure of human belief and the consequent course of civilization. Professor Shayera points out that the Bible does not give us one creation story, but several of them. The one which happens to be featured in chapter 1 of Genesis appears to be the one which had the least vogue among the common people. It was evidently produced in scholarly circles. He then discusses the differences between the religions of today and the ancient worship, saying, just a few years ago, we succeeded in piecing together from a large number of tablets the complete story of an ancient Sumerian myth. I used to call it the Darwinian theory of the Sumerians. The myth must have been widely circulated, for many copies of it have already come to light. In common with the biblical story, a woman plays the dominant role, just as Eve did, but the resemblance ends there. Poor Eve has been damned by all subsequent generations for her deed, while the Babylonians thought so much of their woman ancestress that they defied her. Now, as I read these other myths, it was apparent that the archetypal woman in ancient religions, as represented by the goddess, was quite different in many respects from the woman Eve. I then observed that many of these origin and creation legends came from the lands of Canaan, Egypt, and Babylon, the very same lands in which the Adam and Eve myth had been developed. The other legends of creation were from the mythical religious literature of the people who did not worship the Hebrew Yahweh or Jehovah, but were in fact the closest neighbors of those early Hebrews. Who was she? It was not long before the various pieces of evidence fell into place and the connections began to take form. And then I understood Ashtoreth, the despised pagan deity of the Old Testament, was, despite the efforts of biblical scribes, to disguise her identity by repeatedly using the masculine gender, actually Astarte, the great goddess, as she was known in Canaan, the Near Eastern queen of heaven. Those heathen idol worshippers of the Bible had been praying to a woman god, elsewhere known as Enin, Inanna, Nana, Nut, Anat, Anahita, Istar, Isis, Aset, Eshara, Ashira, Ashtart, Ataret, Atar, and Hathor, the many named divine ancestress. Yet each name denoted in the various languages and dialects of those who revered her, the great goddess. Was it merely coincidence that during all those years of Sunday school I never learned that Ashtoreth was female? Even more astonishing was the archaeological evidence which proved that her religion had existed and flourished in the Near and Middle East for thousands of years before the arrival of patriarchal Abraham, first prophet of the male deity Yahweh. Archaeologically, or archaeologists had traced the worship of the goddess back to the Neolithic communities of about 7000 BC, some to the Upper Paleolithic cultures of about 25,000 BC. From the time of its Neolithic origins, its existence was repeatedly attested to until well into Roman times. Yet Bible scholars agree that it was as late as somewhere between 1800 and 1550 BC that Abraham had lived in Canaan or Palestine. Who was this goddess? Why had a female rather than a male been designated as the supreme deity? How influential and significant was her worship? And when had it actually begun? As I asked myself these questions, I began to probe even deeper into Neolithic and Paleolithic times. Though goddesses have been worshipped in all areas of the world, I focused on the religion as it evolved in the Near and Middle East, since these were the lands where both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were born. I found that the development of the religion of the female deity in this area was intertwined with the earliest beginnings of religion so far discovered anywhere on Earth. Dawn in the Gravettian Garden of Eden. The Upper Paleolithic period, though most of its sites have been found in Europe, is the conjectural foundation of the religion of the goddess as it emerged in the later Neolithic age of the Near East. Since it precedes the time of written records and does not directly lead into an historical period that might have helped to explain it, the information on the Paleolithic existence of goddess worship must at this time remain speculative. Theories on the origins of the goddess in this period are founded on the juxtaposition of mother kinship customs to ancestor worship. They are based upon three separate lines of evidence. The first relies on anthropological analogy to explain the initial development of matrilineal or mother kinship societies. Studies of primitive tribes over the last few centuries have led to the realization that some isolated primitive peoples, even in our own century, did not yet possess the conscious understanding of the relationship of sex to conception. The analogy is then drawn that Paleolithic people may have been at a similar level of biological awareness. Jacquetta Hawkes wrote in 1963 that Australian and a few other primitive peoples did not understand biological paternity or accept a necessary connection between sexual intercourse and conception. In that same year, S.G.F. Brandon, professor of comparative religion at the University of Manchester in England, observed how the infant came to be in the womb was undoubtedly a mystery to primitive man. In view of the period that separates impregnation from birth, it seems probable that the significance of gestation and birth was appreciated long before it was realized that these phenomena were the result of conception following coition. James Fraser, Margaret Mead, and other anthropologists, writes Leonard Cottrell, have established that in the very early stages of man's development, before the secret of human fecundity was understood, before coitus was associated with childbirth, the female was revered as the giver of life. Only women could produce their own kind, and man's part in this process was not as yet recognized. According to these authors, as well as many authorities who have written on this subject, in the most ancient human societies, people probably did not yet possess the conscious understanding of the relationship of sex to reproduction. Thus, the concepts of paternity and fatherhood would not yet have been understood. Though probably accompanied by various mythical explanations, babies were simply born from women. If this was the case, then the mother would have been seen as the singular parent of her family, the lone producer of the next generation, For this reason, it would be natural for children to take the name of their mother's tribe or clan. Accounts of descent in the family would be kept through the female line, going from mother to daughter rather than from father to son, as is the custom practiced in Western societies today. Such a social structure is generally referred to as matrilineal, that is, based upon mother kinship. In such cultures, known among many primitive peoples even today, as well as in historically attested societies at the time of classical Greece, not only the names, but titles, possessions, and territorial rights are passed along through the female line so that they may be retained within the family clan. Hawks points out that in Australia, in areas where the concept of paternity had not yet been understood, there is much to show that matrilineal descent and matrilocal marriage, the husband moving to the wife's family, home, or village, were general and the status of women much higher. She writes that these customs still prevail in parts of Africa and among the Dravidians of India, and relics of them in Melanesia, Micronesia, and Indonesia. The second line of evidence concerns the beginnings of religious beliefs and rituals and their connection with matrilineal descent. There have been numerous studies of Paleolithic cultures, explorations of sites occupied by these people, and the apparent rites connected with the disposal of their dead. These suggest that as the earliest concepts of religion developed, they probably took the form of ancestor worship. Again, an analogy is drawn between the Paleolithic people and the religious concepts and rituals observed among many of the primitive tribes studied by anthropologists over the last 2 centuries. Ancestor worship occurs among tribal people the world over. Meringer states that even at the time of his writing, 1956, certain tribes in Asia were still making small statues known as dezuli. Explaining these, he says, the idols are female and represent the human origins of the whole tribe. Thus, as the religious concepts of the earliest Homo sapiens were developing, the quest for the ultimate source of life, perhaps the core of all theological thought, may have begun. In these Upper Paleolithic societies, in which the mother may have been regarded as the sole parent of the family, ancestor worship was apparently the basis of sacred ritual, and accounts of ancestry were probably reckoned only through the matriline. The concept of the creator of all human life may have been formulated by the clan's image of the woman who had been their most ancient, their primal ancestor, and that image thereby deified and revered as divine ancestress. The third line of evidence, and the most tangible, derives from the numerous sculptures of women found in the Gravettian Aurignacian cultures of the Upper Paleolithic age. Some of these date back as far as 25,000 BC. These small figurines, made of stone and bone and clay and often referred to as Venus figures, have been found in areas where small settled communities once lived. They were often discovered lying close to the remains of the sunken walls of what were probably the earliest human made dwellings on Earth. Meringer claims that niches or depressions had been made in the walls to hold the figurines. These statues of women, some seemingly pregnant, have been found throughout the widespread Gravettian Aurignacian sites in areas as far apart as Spain, France, Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Czechoslovakia, and Russia. These sites and figures appear to span a period of at least 10 years. It appears highly probable, then, says Meringer, that the female figurines were idols of a great mother cult practiced by the non nomadic Aurignacian mammoth hunters who inhabited the immense Eurasian territories that extended from southern France to Lake Baikal in Siberia. Incidentally, it is from this Lake Baikal area in Siberia that the tribes which migrated to North America, supposedly about this same period, their developing into the American Indians, are believed to have originated. that's another story for another day. Russian paleontologist Z.A. Abramova, quoted in Alexander Marshak's recent book, Roots of Civilization, offers a slightly different interpretation, writing that in the Paleolithic religion, the image of the woman mother was a complex one, and it included diverse ideas related to the special significance of the woman in early clan society. She was neither a god, an idol, nor the mother of a god. She was the clan mother. The ideology of the hunting tribes in this period of the matriarchal clan was reflected in the female figurines. The Neolithic mourning. The connections between the Paleolithic female figurines and the later emergence of the goddess worshipping societies in the Neolithic periods of the Near and Middle East are not definitive, but are suggested by many authorities. At the Gravidian site of Vestinus, Czechoslovakia, where Venus figures were not only formed but hardened in an oven, the carefully arranged grave of a woman was found. She was about 40 years old. She had been supplied with tools, covered with mammoth shoulder blade bones, and strewn with red ochre. In a proto Neolithic site at Shanidar on the southern stretches of the Tigris River, another, another grave was found, this one dating from about 9000 BC. It was the burial of a slightly younger woman, once again strewn with red ochre. One of the most significant links between the two periods are the female figurines, understood in Neolithic societies through their emergence into the historic period of written records to represent the goddess. The sculptures of the Paleolithic cultures and those of the Neolithic periods are remarkably similar in materials, size, and most astonishing in style. Hawks commented on the relationship between the two periods, noting that the Paleolithic female figures are extraordinarily like the mother or earth goddesses of the agricultural peoples of Eurasia in the Neolithic age and must be directly ancestral to them. E.O. James also remarks on the similarity, saying of the Neolithic statues, many of them are quite clearly allied to the Gravidian Paleolithic prototypes. But perhaps most significant is the fact that Aurignacian sites have now been discovered near Antalya, about 60 miles from the Neolithic goddess worshipping community of Hasalar in Anatolia or Turkey, and at Musadag in northern Syria, once a part of Canaan. James Millard, formerly the assistant director of the British Institute of Archaeology at Ankara, now teaching at the Institute of Archaeology in London, describes the Proto-Neolithic cultures of the Near East, dating them at about 9000 to 7000 BC. He writes that during that time, art makes its appearance in the form of animal carvings and statuettes of the supreme deity, the mother goddess. These Neolithic communities emerged with the earliest evidences of agricultural development, which is what defines them as Neolithic. They appear in areas later known as Canaan, Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, in Anatolia or Turkey, and along the northern reaches of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Iraq, and Syria. It may be significant that all these cultures possessed obsidian, which was probably acquired from the closest site of availability, Anatolia. One of these sites, near Lake Van, would be directly on the route from the Russian steppes into the Near East. At the site that is now known as Jericho in Canaan, by 7000 BC, people were living in plastered brick houses, some with clay ovens with chimneys and even sockets for doorposts. Rectangular plaster shrines had already appeared. Sybil von Klesreden writes of Jericho. Various finds point to an active religious life. Female clay figures with their hands raised to their breasts resemble idols of the mother goddess, which were later so widely disseminated in the Near East. Millard, too, writes of Jericho. They carefully made small clay figures of the mother goddess type. Another Neolithic community was centered in Jarmo in northern Iraq from about 6800 BC. H.W.F. Saggs, professor of Semitic languages, tells us that in Jarmo there were figurines in clay of animals as well as of a mother goddess. The mother goddess represented by such figurines seems to have been the central figure in Neolithic religion. Hasalar, some 60 miles from the Aurignacian site of Antalya, was inhabited at about 6000 BC. Here, too, figures of the goddess have been found, and at the excavations of Catalhoyuk, close to close to the Cilician plains of Anatolia, near present-day Konya, Millard discovered no less than 40 shrines dating from 6500 BC onward. The culture of Catalhoyuk existed for nearly 1,000 years. Millard reveals the statues allow us to recognize the main deities worshipped by Neolithic people at Catalhoyuk. The principal deity was a goddess who is shown in her three aspects: as a young woman, a mother giving birth, or as an old woman. Mellard suggests that there may have been a majority of women at Catalhoyuk, as evidenced by the number of female burials. At Catalhoyuk, two red ochre was strewn on the bodies. Nearly all of the red ochre burials were of women. He also suggests that the religion was primarily associated with the role of women in the initial development of agriculture, and adds, it seems extremely likely that the cult of the goddess was administered mainly by women. By about 5500 BC, houses had been built with groups of rooms around a central courtyard, a style used by many architects even today. These were found in sites along the northern reaches of the Tigris River in communities that represent what is known as the Hasuna period. There, as in other Neolithic communities, archaeologists found agricultural tools such as the hoe and sickle, storage jars for corn, and clay ovens. And once again, Professor Saggs reports the religious ideas of the Hasuna period are reflected in clay figurines of the mother goddess. One of the most sophisticated prehistoric cultures of the ancient Near and Middle East was situated along the banks of the northern Tigris and westward as far as the Habur River. It is known as the Halaf culture and appeared in various places by 5000 BC. At these Halaf sites, small towns with cobbled streets have been discovered. Metal was in use, which would place the Halaf cultures into a period labeled by archaeologists as Chalcolithic. Saggs writes that judging from a picture on a ceramic base, it is probably from the Halaf period that the invention of wheeled vehicles date. Goddess figurines have been found at all Halaf sites, but at the Halafian town of Arpachaya, these figures were associated with serpents, double axes, and doves, all symbols connected with goddess worship as it was known in historical periods. Along with the intricately designed polychrome ceramic ware, at Arpachaya, buildings known as doloi appeared. These were circular shaped rooms up to 33 feet in diameter with well engineered vaulted ceilings. The round structures were connected to long rectangular corridors up to 63 feet in length. Since it was close to these tholoi that most of the goddess figurines were discovered, it is likely that they were used as shrines. By 4000 BC, goddess figures appeared at Ur and Uruk, both situated on the southern end of the Euphrates River, not far from the Persian Gulf. At about this same period, the Neolithic Badarian and Amratian cultures of Egypt first appeared. It is at these sites that agriculture first emerged in Egypt. And once again, in these Neolithic communities of Egypt, goddess figurines were discovered. From this point on, with the invention of writing, history emerged in both Sumer, southern Iraq, and Egypt about 3000 BC. In every area of the Near and Middle East, the goddess was known in historic times. Though many centuries of transformation had undoubtedly changed the religion in various ways, the worship of the female deity survived into the classical periods of Greece and Rome. It was not totally suppressed until the time of the Christian emperors of Rome and Byzantium, who closed down the last goddess temples in about 500 AD. Goddess, as people today think of God. The archaeological artifacts suggest that in all the Neolithic and early Chalcolithic societies, the divine ancestress, generally referred to by most writers as the mother goddess, was revered as the supreme deity. Now she provided not only human life but a controllable food supply as well. C. Dawson, writing in 1928, surmised that the earliest agriculture must have grown up around the shrines of the mother goddess, which thus became social and economic centers as well as holy places and were the germs of future cities. W. Schmidt, quoted by Joseph Campbell in Primitive Mythology, says of these early cultures, here it was the women who showed themselves supreme. They were not only the bearers of children, but also the chief producers of food, by realizing that it was possible to cultivate and well as to gather. They had made the earth valuable, and they became consequently its possessors. Thus, they won both economic and social power and prestige. Hawks in 1963 added that there is every reason to suppose that under the conditions of the primary Neolithic way of life, mother right and the clan system were still dominant, and the land would generally have descended through the female line. Though at first the goddess appears to have reigned alone, at some yet unknown point in time she acquired a son or brother, depending upon the geographic location, who was also her lover and consort. He is known through the symbolism of the earliest historic periods and is generally assumed to have been a part of the female religion in much earlier times. Professor E. O. James writes whether or not this reflects a primeval system of matriarchal social organization, as is by no means improbable, the fact remains that the goddess at first had precedence over the young god with whom she was associated as her son or husband or lover. It was this youth who was symbolized by the male role in the sacred annual sexual union with the goddess. This ritual is known from historic times, but is generally believed to have been known in the Neolithic period of the religion. Known in various languages as Dumuzi, Tammuz, Attis, Adonis, Osiris, or Baal, this consort died in his youth, causing an annual period of grief and lamentation among those who paid homage to the goddess. The symbolism and rituals connected with him will be more fully explained in the chapter on the male consort, but wherever this dying young consort appears as the male deity, we may recognize the presence of the religion of the goddess. The legends and lamentation rituals of which are extraordinarily similar in so many cultures. This relationship of the goddess to her son, or in certain places to a handsome youth who symbolized the sun, was known in Egypt by 3000 BC. It occurred in the earliest literature of Sumer, emerged in later Babylon, Anatolia, and Canaan, survived in the classical Greek legend of Aphrodite and Adonis, and was even known in pre Christian Rome as the rituals of Cybele and Attis, possibly there influencing the symbolism and rituals of early Christianity. It is one of the major aspects of the religion which bridges the vast expanses covered both geographically and chronologically. But just as the people of the early Neolithic cultures may have come down from Europe as the possible descendants of the Gravidian or Ignatian cultures, so later waves of even more northern peoples descended into the Near East. There has been some conjecture that these were the descendants of the Mesolithic, about 15,000 to 8,000 BC, Maglemosian and Kunda cultures of northern Europe. As I shall explain more fully later, their arrival was not a gradual assimilation into the area, as the goddess peoples seems to have been, but rather a series of aggressive invasions resulting in the conquest area by area of the goddess people. These northern invaders, generally known as Indo-Europeans, brought their own religion with them, the worship of a young warrior god and or a supreme father god. Their arrival is archaeological and historically attested by 2400 BC, but several invasions may have occurred even earlier. The nature of the northern invaders, their religion, and its effect upon the goddess worshipping people will be more thoroughly described and discussed in chapters 4 and 5. But the pattern that emerged after the invasions was an amalgamation of the two theologies, the strength of one or the other often noticeably different from city to city. As the invaders gained more territories and continued to grow more powerful over the next 2,000 years, this synthesized religion often juxtaposed the female and male deities not as equals, but with the male as the dominant husband or even as her murderer. Yet myths, statues, and the documentary evidence reveal the continual presence of the goddess and the survival of the customs and rituals connected to the religion, despite the efforts of the conquerors to destroy or belittle the ancient worship. Although the earliest examples of written language yet discovered anywhere on earth appeared at the Temple of the Queen of Heaven in Erech in Sumer just before 3000 BC, writing at that time seems to have been used primarily for the business accounts of the temple. The arriving northern groups adopted this manner of writing, known as cuneiform, small wedge signs pressed into damp clay, and used it for their own records and literature. Professor Shayera comments, it is strange to notice that practically all the existing literature was put down in written form a century or two after 2000 BC. Whether this suggests that written language was never considered as a medium for myths and legends before that time, or that existing tablets were destroyed and rewritten at that time remains an open question. But unfortunately, it means that we must rely on literature that was written after the start of the northern invasions and conquests. Yet the survival and revival of the goddess as supreme in certain areas, the customs, the rituals, the prayers, the symbolism of the myths, as well as the evidence of temple sites and statues, provide us with a great deal of information on the worship of the goddess at that time. And to a certain extent, they allow us, by observing the progression of transitions that took place over the next 2,000 years, to extrapolate backward to better understand the nature of the religion as it may have existed in earlier historic and Neolithic times. As I mentioned previously, the worship of the female deity has for the most part been included as a minor addition to the study of the patterns of religious beliefs in ancient cultures, most writers apparently preferring to discuss periods when male deities had already gained prominence. In many books, a cursory mention of the goddess often precedes lengthy dissertations about the male deities who replaced her. Most misleading are the vague inferences that the veneration of a female deity was a separate, minor, unusual, or curious occurrence. Since most books are concerned with one specific geographic area, this is partially the result of the fact that the goddess was identified by a specific name or names which were native to that location, and the overall connections are simply never mentioned. Upon closer scrutiny, however, it becomes clear that so many of the names used in diverse areas were simply various titles of the great goddess, epithets such as Queen of Heaven, Lady of the High Place, Celestial Ruler, Lady of the Universe, Sovereign of the Heavens, Lioness of the Sacred Assembly, or simply Her Holiness. Often the name of the town or city was added, which made the name even more specific. We are not, however, confronting a confusing myriad of deities, but a variety of titles resulting from diverse languages and dialects, yet each referring to a most similar female divinity. Once gaining this broader and more overall view, it becomes evident that the female deity in the Near and Middle East was revered as goddess, much as people today think of God. In Strong and Garstang's Syrian Goddess of 1913, some of the connections are explained. Among the Babylonians and northern Semites, she was Ishtar. She is Ashtoreth of the Bible and Astarte of Phoenicia. In Syria, her name was Athar, and in Cilicia, it had the form of At or Athe. In Robert Graves' translation of the Golden Ass by the Roman writer Apuleius of the 2nd century AD, the goddess herself appears and explains, I am nature, the universal mother, mistress of all elements, primordial child of time, sovereign of all things spiritual, queen of the dead, queen also of the immortals, the single manifestation of all gods and goddesses that are. My nod governs the shining heights of heavens, the wholesome sea breezes, the lamentable silences of the world below. Though I am worshipped in many aspects, known by countless names, and propitiated with all manner of different rites, yet the whole round earth venerates me. The primeval Phrygians call me Pessinuntica, mother of the gods. The Athenians, sprung from their own soil, call me Cecropian Artemis. For the islanders of Cyprus, I am Papian Aphrodite. For the archers of Crete, I am Dictina. For the trilingual Cilicians, Stygian, Prosperin. And for the Eleusinians, their ancient mother of corn. Some know me as Juno, some as Bellona of the battles, others as Hecate, others again as Ramnubia, but both races of Ethiopians whose lands the morning sun first shines upon, and the Egyptians who excel in ancient learning and worship me with ceremonies proper to my godhead, call me by my true name, namely Queen Isis. Ironically, Isis was the Greek translation for the Egyptian goddess Aset. The similarities of statues, titles, symbols such as the serpent, the cow, the dove, and the double axe, the relationship of the son/lover who dies and is mourned annually, eunuch priest, the sacred annual sexual union, and the sexual customs of the temple, each reveal the overlapping and underlying connections between the worship of the female deity in areas as far apart in space and time as the earliest records of Sumer to classical Greece and Rome. The deification and worship of the female divinity in so many parts of the ancient world were variations on a theme, slightly differing versions of the same basic theological beliefs, those that originated in the earliest periods of human civilization. It is difficult to grasp the immensity and significance of the extreme reverence paid to the goddess over a period of either 25,000, as the Upper Paleolithic evidence suggests, or even 7,000 years and over miles of land, cutting across national boundaries and vast expanses of sea. Yet it is vital to do just that to fully comprehend the longevity as well as the widespread power and influence this religion once held. According to poet and mythologist Robert Graves, the whole of Neolithic Europe, to judge from surviving artifacts and myths, had a remarkably homogeneous system of religious ideas based on the many titled Mother Goddess, who was also known in Syria and Libya. The great goddess was regarded as immortal, changeless, omnipotent, and the concept of fatherhood had not yet been introduced into religious thought. Much the same religion that Graves discusses existed even earlier in the areas known today as Iraq, Iran, India, Arabia, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Sinai, Libya, Syria, Turkey, Greece, and Italy, as well as the large islands of Crete, Cyprus, Malta, Sicily, and Sardinia. There were instances of much the same worship in the Neolithic periods of Europe, which began at about 3000 BC. The Tuatha De Danann traced their origins back to a goddess they brought with them to Ireland long before the arrival of Roman culture. The Celts, who now comprise a major part of the populations of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, were known to the Romans as the Gauls. They are known to have sent priests to a sacred festival for the goddess Sibyl in Pessinus, Anatolia, in the 2nd century BC, and the evidence of carvings at Karnak and the Gallic shrines of Chartres and Mont Saint Michel in France suggest that these places were once sites of the great goddess. From India to the Mediterranean, she reigned supreme. The status and origins of the great goddess have been discussed in several studies of ancient worship. The primary interest of most of these scholars was in the son/lover and the transition from the female to the male religions. But each of their statements reveal that the original status of the goddess was as supreme deity. In 1962, James Millard describes the cultures of 9000 to 7000 BC in his earliest civilizations of the Near East. As I mentioned previously, he pointed out that at that time, art makes its appearance in the form of animal carvings and statuettes of the supreme deity, the mother goddess. He writes that at Catalhoyuk of the 7th millennium, the principal deity was a goddess. In describing the site of ancient Hasalar, a Neolithic community by 5800 BC, he directs our attention to the fact that the statuettes portray the goddess and the male occurs only in a subsidiary role as child or paramour. One figure of the goddess from Hasalar is now in the museum in Ankara, which houses most of the pieces found at Hasalar and Catalhoyuk by Millard's excavations. Their antiquity contrasting strangely with its contemporary architecture and decor. This particular sculpture of the goddess appears to depict her in the act of making love, though the male figure is broken and represented only by a small fragment of his waist, thighs, and one leg. There is the possibility that this is an older child being held close, but it appears more likely to be an adolescent youth, perhaps intended to portray the son/lover of the female deity some 8,000 years ago. In The Lost World of Elam, published in 1973, Dr. Walter Hinz, director of the Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Göttingen in Germany, also discusses the worship of the goddess in the Near and Middle East. The nation of Elam was just east of Sumer, and in early historic periods, the two cultures were in close contact. Dr. Hinz writes that pride of place in this world was taken by a goddess, and this is typical of Elam. She was clearly the great mother of the gods to the Elamites. The very fact that precedence was given to a goddess who stood above and apart from the other Elamite gods indicates a matriarchal approach in the devotees of this religion. Dr. Hinz describes the goddess as she was known in various centers of the Elamite territories and then tells us, in the 3rd millennium, these great mothers of the gods still held undisputed sway at the head of the Elamite pantheon, but a change came during the course of the 2nd. Just as the age-old matriarchy of Elam had once yielded in the face of a gradual rise in the position of men, so corresponding arrangement took place among the gods. During the 3rd millennium, he, Humban, the consort of the goddess, still occupied the third place. But from the middle of the second millennium, he stood at the head of the pantheon. Explaining the precedence of the female deity among the Semites, which include both the Arab and Hebrew peoples. Robertson Smith, in his prophetic work of 1894, Religion of the Semites, asserted that the female divinity in Semitic religion was deified as a direct result of the juxtaposition of ancestor worship and a female kinship system. At that time, he wrote, recent researches into the history of the family render it in the highest degree improbable that the physical kinship between the god and his worshippers, of which traces are found all over the Semitic area, was originally conceived as fatherhood. It was the mother's, not the father's blood, which formed the original bond of kinship among the Semites, as among other early people. And in this stage of society, if the tribal deity was thought of as the parent of the stock, a goddess, not a god, would necessarily have been the object of worship. In Mesopotamia, the goddess is supreme, wrote Professor Henry Frankfurt in his 1948 publication of Kingship and the Gods, because the source of all life is seen as female. Hence, the god too descends from her and is called her son, though he is also her husband. In the ritual of the sacred marriage, the goddess holds the initiative throughout. Even in the condition of chaos, the female Tiamat is the leader and Apsu merely her male complement. Within his 12 extensive volumes of research on ancient and primitive religion, published in 1907, Sir James Frazer wrote of the Egyptian goddess Isis, or Aset, and her brother slash husband Osiris, or Asar. In addition to the volumes of the Golden Bow, he published a separate book, Attis, Adonis, and Osiris, a title also used for several of the sections of the Golden Bow. In both works, he asserted that according to Egyptian mythology, Isis was the stronger divinity of the pair. He related this to the system of property and descent practiced in Egypt, which he described as mothered kinship. He referred to the young lover of the goddess as the mythical personification of nature and explained that it was required that this figure should be sexually coupled with the supreme female deity. Of the lad's status and position within the religion, he commented, in each case, Attis, Adonis, and Osiris, it appears that originally the goddess was a more powerful and important personage than the god. In his 1928 Handbook of Greek Mythology, H.J. Rose discussed the role of the young male in the sacred sexual union and described him as her inferior male partner, observing, so far we have been dealing with legends which represent the goddess not as married, but as forming more or less temporary unions with someone much inferior to herself. A proceeding quite characteristic of Oriental goddesses who are essentially mothers but not wives, and besides whom their lovers sink into comparative insignificance. A description of the relationship between the goddess and her son slash lover was included by Professor E.O. James in his 1960 publication, The Ancient Gods. He explained her supremacy in this way. It was she who was responsible for his recovery and his resuscitation, on which the renewal of nature depended, so that in the last analysis, Inanna slash Ishtar, not Dumuzi slash Tammuz, was the ultimate source of life and regeneration, though the young god as her agent was instrumental in the process. With the establishment of husbandry and domestication, however, the function of the male in the process of generation became more apparent and vital, and the mother goddess was then assigned to a spouse to play his role as the begetter, even though, as in Mesopotamia, for example, he was her youthful son slash lover or her servant. From India to the Mediterranean, in fact, she reigned supreme, often appearing as the unmarried goddess. Arthur Evans, eminent Oxford scholar and noted archaeologist who located, unearthed, and even partially reconstructed the royal complex at Knossos on the island of Crete, commented in 1936, "It is certain that, however much the male element had asserted itself in the domain of government by the great days of the Minoan civilization, the religion still continued to reflect the older matriarchal stage of social development. Clearly, the goddess was supreme." Discussing Anatolia, which was closely related to Minoan Crete throughout colonization and trade, Evans wrote, "Throughout a large part of Anatolia, again we recognize the cult of the same great mother with her male satellite husband, lover, or child, as the case may be." Another Oxford scholar of the late 19th century, L.R. Farnold, wrote about Crete as early as 1896. In his series of volumes, The Cults of the Greek States, he commented that, "We may then safely conclude from the evidence so far available that the earliest religion of civilized Crete was mainly devoted to a great goddess, while the male deity, always inevitable in goddess cult, was subordinate and kept in the background." Robertson Smith wrote of the position of the goddess in Arabia, who he had previously suggested was originally deified as the parent of the stock. He described the transition of power that then took place. In Arabian religion, a goddess and a god were paired, the goddess being supreme, the god her son, or a lesser deity. Gradually, there was a change whereby the attributes of the goddess were presented to the god, thus lowering the position of the female below the male. Smith pointed out that the goddess was still known in later patriarchal religion and claimed that her worship was attached to cults, which found their origins in the ages of mother kinship. He then discussed the time when the change in the law of kinship deprived the mother of her old preeminence in the family and transferred to the father the greater part of her authority and dignity. Women lost the right to choose their own partners at will. The wife became subject to her husband's lordship. At the same time, her children became, for all purposes of inheritance and all duties of blood, members of his and not her kin. So far as the religion kept pace with the new laws of social morality, due to this development, the independent divine mother necessarily became the subordinate partner of a male deity, or if the supremacy of the goddess was too well established to be thus undermined, she might change her sex as in southern Arabia, where Ishtar was transformed into the masculine Aptar. Summing up, he observed that upon the acceptance of male kinship, the woman was placed in a subordinate status, and the principal position in the religion was no longer held by the goddess, but by a god. Though Smith presented the change as taking place rather naturally, as I have already mentioned and will describe in greater detail later, the transition was actually accomplished by violent aggression, brutal massacres, and territorial conquest throughout the Near and Middle East. After reading these and numerous other studies on the subject, there was no longer any doubt in my mind of the existence of the ancient female religion, nor that in the earliest of theological systems, woman was deified as the principal and supreme divine being. It is this religion, one so widespread throughout the ancient world, its similarities and its local differences, that will be described throughout the rest of the book. It will once more be divided by specific names and locations, since that is how the available material is most comprehensible. But we can hardly avoid perceiving the numerous resemblances and similarities of the religion as it was known and practiced in one culture with its forms and rituals in another. That this religion preceded the male religions by thousands of years was also quite evident. But this information, rather than satisfying my curiosity, simply aroused it further. Most directly meaningful to me were a multitude of questions concerning the position and status of women who had actually lived in societies in which the divine ancestress had been revered. Chapter 3: Women, where woman was deified. The question most pressing, perhaps the one that has most insistently caused this book to come into being, is this: what effect did the worship of the female deity actually have upon the status of women in the cultures in which she was extolled? Hines, Evans, Langdon, and many others have referred to the ancient goddess worshipping societies as matriarchal. Exactly what does this imply? It would be easy to enter into a seesaw type of reasoning here. That is to say, they worship the goddess, therefore, women must have held a high status, or because women held a high status, therefore, a goddess was worshipped. Though these two factors, if we judge by the attitudes of the societies that worship the male deities of today, may have been closely related, yet various views of the subject should be considered, even those in which cause and effect appear to be confused or simultaneous events are perceived as linear. What we want to achieve is as comprehensive and understanding as possible of the relationship of the female religion to the position of women. In The Dominant Sex, M. Verding, writing in Germany in 1923, asserted that the sex of the deity was determined by the sex of those who were in power. The ruling sex, having the power to diffuse its own outlooks, tend to generalize its specific ideology. Should the trends of the subordinate sex run counter, they are likely to be suppressed all the more forcibly in proportion as the dominant sex is more overwhelming. The result is that the hegemony of male deities is usually associated with the dominance of men, and the hegemony of female deities with the dominance of women. Sir James Frazer believed that the high status of women was initially responsible for the veneration and esteem of the female deity. He cited the Pelu clan of Micronesia, where the women were considered to be socially and politically superior to men. This preference for goddesses over gods, he wrote, in the clan of the Pelu Islanders has been explained, no doubt rightly, by the high importance of women in the social system of the people. Robertson Smith connected the choice of the sex of the supreme deity to the position of dominance of the male or female within the family. He suggested that as a result of the kinship system, the sexual identity of the head of the family formulated the sexual identity of the supreme deity. Each of these is an example of the theory that the sex of the deity is determined by a previously existing dominance of one sex over the other. In the case of the goddess, the higher position of women in the family and in society. Alongside these theories, there have been reams of pseudo-poetic material about the deification of the female as the symbol of fertility by the male, the awe of the magic of her ability to produce a child, supposedly making her the object of his worship. As I just mentioned, Frazer suggested that the high status of women led to the worship of the goddess as supreme being, basing his conclusions on years of study of primitive and classical societies. But as a result of this research, he also connected the worship of the female deity to a mother kinship system and ancestor worship, explaining that wherever the goddess is superior to the god and ancestresses more reverently worship than ancestors, there is nearly always a mother kin structure. Robertson Smith also related the sexual identity of the supreme deity to the kinship system prevalent in each society. Whatever the suggested order of cause and effect, one of the major factors which continually appears in the material concern with the status and role of women in the ancient female religion in historic times is its close connection to female kinship. Matrilineality, perhaps the very origins of its development. In examining the position of women, this mother or female kin structure leading to matrilineal descent of name and property should be carefully studied. Matrilineality is generally defined as that societal structure in which inheritance takes place through the female line, sons, husbands, or brothers gaining access to title and property only as the result of their relationship to the woman who is the legal owner. Matrilineal descent does not mean matriarchy, which is defined as women in power, or more specifically, the mother as the head of the family, taking this position in community or state government as well. In some matrilineal societies, the brother of the woman who holds the rights to the name and property plays an important role. Yet we cannot ignore the probability that matrilineal and matrilocal customs would affect the status and position of women in various ways. The subtleties of the power and bargaining position that come with the ownership of house, property, or title, or as in matrilocal societies, women residing in the village or home of their own parents rather than their in laws should be considered. The economics of the Neolithic and early historic agricultural societies were discussed by sociologist V. Klein in 1946. She suggested that in early society, women wielded the main sources of wealth. They were the owners of the house, the producers of food, they provided shelter and security. Economically, therefore, man was dependent upon woman. Societies that followed female or mother kinship customs have been known in the past and still appear in many areas of the world. The theory that most societies were originally matrilineal, matriarchal, and even polyandrous, meaning one woman with several husbands, was the subject of several extensive studies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Scholars such as Johann Backofen, Robert Briffault, and Edward Hartland accepted the idea of ancient matriarchy and polyandry, substantiating their theories with a great deal of evidence, but they regarded these systems as a specific stage in evolutionary development. They suggested that all societies had to pass through a matriarchal stage before becoming patriarchal and monogamous, which they appear to have regarded as a superior stage of civilization. But as Jaquetta Hawks observes, today it is unfashionable to talk about former, more matriarchal orders of society. Nevertheless, there is evidence from many parts of the world that the role of women has weakened since earlier times in several sections of social structure. Most of these studies of matriarchy were based upon anthropological analogy and the classical literature of Greece and Rome. Since most of these works were researched in the 19th and earliest part of the 20th centuries, these writers did not have access to much of the archaeological evidence that is available today. Despite specific misunderstandings or biased value judgments, we may yet find that these writers were prophetically ahead of their time. Today, we have the use of a much greater body of material produced by extensive archaeological excavation of the Near and Middle East throughout this century, as well as the material available to those earlier writers. It is true that the chance fortunes of archaeological finds, what remains undiscovered, what is found too damaged to read, what cannot be deciphered, and what has perished as the result of the nature of the original material, present some limitations. Hammurabi's Law Code of Babylon, about 1790 BC, long regarded as the oldest ever compiled, is now known to have been preceded by several others, more recently discovered. Still, only one of these dates back to about 2300 BC and the others to about 2000 BC or slightly later. So we must still rely only on material that appears in written form only after the beginnings of the northern invasions. But carefully sifting through the available evidence and commentary, which differ according to location and era, we may gain some insight into the status of women in goddess worshiping societies. The goddess religion, though slowly declining, still existed. Ethiopia, Ethiopia and Libya, all authority was vested in the woman. 49 years before the birth of Christ, a man from Roman Sicily wrote of his travels in northern Africa and some of the Near Eastern countries, regarding recording his observations of people along the way. He was keenly interested in cultural patterns and was certainly one of the forerunners of the fields of anthropology and sociology. This man was known as Diodorus Siculus, Diodorus of Sicily. Many statements reporting the high or even dominant status of women were included in his writings. We may question why he, more than any other classical writer, recorded so much information about women warriors and matriarchy in the nations all about him. He did not belittle the men who lived in such social systems. That did not appear to be his aim. Indeed, he seemed to be rather admiring and respectful of the women who wielded such power. It was Diodorus who reported that the women of Ethiopia carried arms, practiced communal marriage, and raised their children so communally that they often confused even themselves as to who the natural mother had been. In parts of Libya, where the goddess Neith was highly esteemed, accounts of Amazon women still lingered even in Roman times. Diodorus described a nation in Libya as follows: all authority was vested in the woman, who discharged every kind of public duty. The men looked after domestic affairs just as the women do among ourselves and did as they were told by their wives. They were not allowed to undertake war service or to exercise any functions of government or to fill any public office, such as might have given them more spirit to set themselves up against the women. The children were handed over immediately after birth to the men, who reared them on milk and other foods suitable to their age. Diodorus wrote of warrior women existing in Libya, reporting that these women had formed into armies which had invaded other lands. According to him, they revered the goddess as their major deity and set up sanctuaries for her worship. Though he gives no specific name, the accounts probably refer to the Libyan warrior goddess known as Neith, who was also revered under that name in Egypt. Egypt, while the husbands stay home and weave. In prehistoric Egypt, the goddess held supremacy in Upper Egypt, the south, as Nekebt, symbolized as a vulture. The people of Lower Egypt, which includes the northern Delta region, worshiped their supreme goddess as a cobra, using the name Ozit, great serpent. From about 3000 BC onward, the goddess known as Nut, Net, or Nit, probably derived from Nekebt, was said to have existed when nothing else had yet been created. She then created all that had come into being. According to Egyptian mythology, it was she who first placed Ra, the sun god, in the sky. Other texts of Egypt tell of the goddess Hathor in this role of creator of existence, explaining that she took the form of a serpent at that time. In Egypt, the concept of the goddess always remained vital. The introduction of male deities, just as the dynastic periods began about 3000 BC, will be more thoroughly discussed in Chapter 4. This probably lessened her original supremacy as it was known in Neolithic societies, but goddess worship continued. And in conjunction with this, the women of Egypt appear to have benefited in many ways. Diodorus wrote at great length of the worship of the goddess Isis. The Greek translation for Aset, who had incorporated the aspects of both Asit and Hathor. Isis was also closely associated with the goddess of Nut, who was mythologically recorded as her mother. In paintings, Isis wore the wings of Nekebt. Diodorus explained that according to Egyptian religion, Isis was revered as the inventor of agriculture, as a great healer and physician, and as the one who first established the laws of justice in the land. He then recorded what we today may find a most startling description of the laws of Egypt, explaining that they were the result of the reverence paid to this mighty goddess. He wrote, "It is for these reasons, in fact, that it was ordained that the queen should have greater power and honor than the king, and that among private persons the wife should enjoy authority over the husband, husbands agreeing in the marriage contract that they will be obedient in all things to their wives." Fraser commented on the relationship between the veneration of Isis and the customs of female kinship and stated that in Egypt, the archaic system of motherkin, with its preference for women over men in matters of property and inheritance, lasted down to Roman times. There is further evidence that Egypt was a land where women had great freedom and control of their own lives and perhaps of their husbands as well. Herodotus of Greece, several centuries before Diodorus, wrote that in Egypt, women go into the marketplace, transact affairs, and occupy themselves with business, while the husbands stay home and weave. His contemporary Sophocles stated that their thoughts and actions all are modeled on Egyptian ways, for there the men sit at the loom indoors while the wives work abroad for their daily bread. Professor Cyrus Gordon wrote in 1953 of life in ancient Egypt. He tells us that in family life, women had a peculiarly important position, for inheritance passed through the mother. Oops. Through the mother rather than the father. This system may well hark back to prehistoric times when only the obvious relationship between mother and child was recognized, but not the less apparent relationship between father and child. Dr. Murray suggests that women's condition was high, due perhaps to their economic independence. S.W. Barron writes that in Egyptian papyri, many women appear as parties in civil litigations and independent business transactions, even with their own husbands and fathers. One of the earliest archaeologists of the pyramids of Egypt, Sir William Flinders Petrie, wrote in 1925 that in Egypt, all property went in the female line. The woman was the mistress of the house, and in early tales, she is represented as having entire control of herself and the place. Discussing the position of women in ancient Egypt, theologian and archaeologist Roland DeVoe wrote in 1965 that in Egypt, the wife was often the head of the family, with all the rights such a position entailed. Obedience was urged upon husbands in the maxims of Ptahhotep. Marriage contracts of all periods attest the extremely independent social and economic position of women. According to E. Meyer, who is quoted in the Verting study, among the Egyptians, the women were remarkably free. As late as the 4th century BC, there existed side by side with patriarchal marriage a form of marriage in which the wife chose the husband and could divorce him on payment of compensation. Love poems discovered in Egyptian tombs strongly hint that it was the Egyptian women who did the courting, oftentimes wooing the male by plying him with intoxicants to weaken his protestations. Robert Briffault wrote of an Egyptian woman clerk who later became a governor and eventually the commander in chief of an army. A most enlightening and significant study on the social structure and position of women in Egypt was done in 1949 by Dr. Margaret Murray, painstakingly tracing the lineage of royal families in Egypt. She eventually proved that at the level of royalty, the Egyptian culture at most periods was matrilineal. Royalty was studied because records for these people were most unavailable. No, records for these people were most available. According to Murray, it was the daughters, not the sons, who were the actual inheritors of the royal throne. She suggests that the custom of brother slash sister marriage then developed, allowing a son to gain access to the royal privilege in this way. She writes that the matrilineal right to the throne was the reason that Egyptian princesses for so many centuries were married within the family and were not available for international marriage alliances. And we will go over that. Well, I already talked about the incest thing, but we're going to talk about it some more. This may clarify why the goddess Isis, who Fraser stated was a more important deity than her brother slash husband Osiris, and whom Diodorus cited as the origin of the generally high position of women in Egypt, was known as the throne. But even in Egypt, women were slowly losing their prestigious position. Sir Flinders Petrie, incidentally a deeply respected colleague of Dr. Murray's at the University of London, discussed the role of priestesses in ancient Egypt. He pointed out how their position had changed between the time of the earliest dynasties, 3000 BC onward, to the 18th dynasty, 1570 through 1300 BC. According to the available records, the goddess known as Hathor, much the same deity as Isis, was in earliest times served by 61 priestesses and 18 priests, while the goddess known as Neith was attended solely by priestesses. By the time of the 18th dynasty, women were no longer even part of the religious clergy, but served only as temple musicians. It is in the 18th dynasty that Egypt was made to feel the greatest influence of the Indo Europeans, a factor again discussed at greater length in chapters 4 and 5. Incidentally, the use of the word pharaoh, generally summoning up images even more powerful than the word king, actually comes from the term par-o, which literally means great house. It was only from the time of the 18th dynasty that the word was used to signify the royal male of that household. Sumer, the women of former days used to take two husbands. Professor Saggs wrote in 1962 of the societies of Mesopotamia, which included both Sumer and Babylon. Mesopotamia generally refers to the areas of Iraq along and between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, starting at the Persian Gulf and reaching up to Anatolia. He examined the relationship of the reverence for goddesses to the status of women in Sumer, about 3000 BC to 1800 BC in southern Iraq, concluding that in the earliest periods, women were much better off than in the later periods and that they gradually lost ground over the years. Professor Sachs reports that the status of women was certainly much higher in the early Sumerian city state than it subsequently became. There are hints that in the very beginning of Sumerian society, women had a much higher status than in the heyday of Sumerian culture. This chiefly rests on the fact that in early Sumerian religion, a prominent position is occupied by goddesses who afterwards virtually disappeared, save with the one exception of Ishtar as consorts to particular gods. The underworld itself was made the sole rule of a goddess, for a myth explains how she came to take a consort, and goddesses played a part in the divine decision making assembly in the myths. There is even one strong suggestion that polyandry may have at one time been practiced for the reforms of Uracagina. it looks like Urakagina referred to women who had taken more than one husband. Some scholars shied away from this conclusion, suggesting that the reference might be only to the remarriage of a widow, but the wording of the Sumerian text does not really support this. I may add that the goddess of the underworld does not merely take a consort, but has her hair pulled, is dragged from the throne, and is threatened with death until she agrees to marry her assailant, the god Nergal, who then kisses away her tears, becomes her husband, and rules beside her. The Urakagina reform is dated at about 2300 BC. It reads, the women of former days used to take two husbands, but the women of today would be stoned with stones if they did this. Polyandry has been reported in the Dravidian goddess worshipping areas of India even in this century. The laws of the Sumerian state of Ashnuna, written about 2000 BC, were found in a small town, thus possibly reflecting older attitudes. In them, we read that if a man rejects his wife after she bears a child and takes another wife, he shall be driven from the house and from whatever he owns, and if any accept him, they may follow him. These same laws also state if a woman is married but has a child with another man while her husband is away at war, she is still legally regarded as the wife of the first man. There is no mention of punishment for adultery. Permission for marriage had to be received from both mother and father. The position and activities of a group of Sumerian women known as the Naditu were studied in depth by Rigva Harris in 1962. Carefully examining Sumerian texts, she found that the Naditu women were engaged in the business activities of the temple, held real estate in their own names, lent money, and generally engaged in various economic activities. She also found accounts at this same period of many women scribes. Yet we read in Professor Sidney Smith's chapter in Hooksmith, Ritual and Kingship, that the word Naditu probably means woman thrown down that is surrendered to the god. In the Sumerian hymns, the female precedes the male. The Epic of Gilgamesh reveals that the official scribe of the Sumerian heaven was a woman, while the initial invention of writing was credited to a goddess. As I mentioned previously, it may well have been the priestesses, possibly the Naditu, who kept the temple business accounts, who first developed the art of writing. The earliest examples of writing from about 3200 BC, discovered in the temple of the goddess Inanna of Erech, where many of the Naditu women lived, turned out to be the temple's accounts of payment for land rental. Stephen Langdon, eminent Oxford scholar writing in 1930, observed that the legends associated with the Sumerian Queen of Heaven, Inanna, had probably been worked out under a matriarchal system of society. This is also suggested by the changes in the image and role of the goddess Inanna. When we find her centuries later as the Babylonian Ishtar. In the Sumerian myth, Inanna exhibited her power and omnipotent wrath at her son slash lover Dumuzi's refusal to show proper respect to her by turning him over to the demons of the land of the dead. While 13 centuries later, in the Babylonian myth of Ishtar, a newer version of much the same story, the goddess grieved at the accidental death of the youth. In general, the records of the Sumerian reforms of Urakagina of about 2300 BC were strongly communally oriented. They referred to the fruit trees and food of the temple lands, which were to be used for those in need rather than by priests, which was apparently fast becoming the custom at that time. The fact that on these tablets it was repeatedly mentioned that these reforms harked back to the way things were done in the earlier periods suggests that the earliest societies of Sumer were more communal. Most interesting is the word used to label these reforms, amarji, which has received the double translation of freedom and return to the mother. Elam, naked before the high priestess. In 1973, Dr. Walter Hines suggested that the original supremacy of the goddess in Elam, slightly east of Sumer and in close contact by 3000 BC, indicated a matriarchal approach in the devotees of her religion. He explained that though she was supreme in the third millennium, she later became secondary to her consort, Humban. She was then known as the Great Wife. In Susa, at the northern end of the Elamite territories, the male consort was known as in Shushanak. In earliest times, he was known as Father of the Weak. By mid-second millennium, he was called King of the Gods, and in the 8th century BC, he was invoked as protector of the gods of heaven and earth. In the earlier periods of Elam, the deities appear to have been served by female and male clergy, the men appearing naked before the high priestess, as was the custom in early Sumer. Hines explains that in Elam, much like the Natatu women of Sumer, one special group among the priestesses was formed by those women or maidens who had dedicated their lives to the great goddess. These women were primarily involved in the buying, selling, and renting of land. Legal documents from Elam, primarily from after 2000 BC, reveal that women were often the sole heirs. One married woman refused to make her inheritance joint with her husband and intended to pass the inheritance along to her daughter. Another tablet stated that a son and a daughter were to share equally. The daughter was mentioned first. Several tablets describe situations where the husband was leaving everything he owned to his wife and insisted that their children would inherit only if they cared for their mother with the greatest respect. Babylon, to hold and manage their own estates. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadians, after a rise in position under Sargon in 2300 BC, eventually gained supremacy in about 1900 BC, gradually superseding the Sumerians as the cultural and political leaders of the area. They formed the nation known as Babylonia, installing their capital in the city of Babylon on the central Euphrates. The Akkadian language of the Babylonians became the international language of the Near East, but the religion of the Sumerians was incorporated into the Babylonian culture, and the Sumerian language was used much as Latin was employed in the masses of the Roman Catholic Church all over the world. By 1600 BC, the Kassites gained control of Babylon. Linguistic evidence suggests that the Kassites were ruled by the northern invaders, the Indo-Europeans, who had gradually infiltrated into Babylon and Assyria. Despite a loss of status in the position of women in Babylon compared with their predecessors of Sumer, a loss that was accompanied by the gaining ascendancy of male deities such as Marduk, who mythically murdered the creator goddess Tiamat to gain and secure his position. The women of Babylon still continued to hold certain rights of independence. The following quote is based upon the law code of Hammurabi, which preceded total Kassite control, but which may have been somewhat affected by continual Indo-European incursions from the north from at least 2000 BC onward. W. Boscawen, writing in 1894, reported that the freedom granted to the women in Babylonia allowed them to hold and manage their own estates, and this was especially the case with priestesses of the temple who traded extensively. One of the most interesting and characteristic features of this early civilization of the Babylonians was the high position of women. The mother here is always represented by a sign, which means goddess of the house. Any sin against the mother, any repudiation against the mother was punished by banishment from the community. These are the facts which are evidently indicative of a people who at one time held the law of matriarchal descent. According to DeVoe, writing in 1965, in Babylonian law, the father gave the young bride certain possessions which belonged to her in her own right, the husband having only the use of them. They reverted to the wife if she was widowed or divorced without fault on her part. In Babylon, she could acquire property, take legal action, be a party to contracts, and she had a certain share in her husband's inheritance. In Hammurabi's time, women were free to request divorce, and one Babylonian law declared that if a wife did not intend to be responsible for her husband's premarital debts, she had to obtain a document from him stating that he had agreed. This assumption of the financial responsibility in marriage suggests that most women may have taken part in business and financial affairs as they did in Egypt, and perhaps at one time had been economically responsible for the family. Seven of Hammurabi's laws were concerned with the priestesses of the temple, their rights to inherit, and what they might or might not pass along to offspring, suggesting that the economic position of these women. I lost my spot. Okay, the economic position of these women was a matter of concern and probably was quickly changing. Ishtar was revered as majestic queen whose decrees are preeminent. In one text, Ishtar herself says, "When at a trial of judgment, I am present. A woman understanding the matter, I am." At Nimrod in northern Mesopotamia, records of women judges and magistrates have been unearthed, testifying to the vital and respected position women held there even in the 8th century BC. In several cities, there were accounts of Babylonian priestesses who acted as oracular prophetesses, providing military and political advice to kings and leaders, revealing their powerful influence upon the affairs of state. Accounts of women scribes occur in all Babylonian periods, though there were more males in this field than women. We find in the laws of later Babylonia, which belonged to some time at the end of the second millennium, that a married woman might no longer engage in business unless it was directed by her husband, son, or brother-in-law. If anyone engaged in business with her, even if he insisted that he did not know she was married, he was to be prosecuted as a criminal. Anatolia, from of old they have been ruled by the women. Just north of Babylon and in very close political contact was the area known as Anatolia, present day Turkey, sometimes known as Asia Minor. In Neolithic periods in Anatolia, the great goddess was extolled. Her worship appeared in the shrines of Catalhuyuk of 6500 BC. Little is yet known of Anatolia directly after the Catalhuyuk period, but sometime before 2000 BC, Anatolia was invaded by the Indo-Europeans. The areas where the northern peoples made the heaviest settlements were in the central and south central sections of Anatolia. Some of them conquered the land known as Hatti. The invaders, as well as the original inhabitants, thus came to be known as the Hittites. And I will go into later how that um, coincides with Haiti and voodoo. Most of the goddesses who appear in the literature and text of this area written after the Hittite arrival were actually the older Hattian deities. One of the most important female deities to survive was the sun goddess of Arena. Upon the Hittite conquest, she was assigned a husband who was symbolized as a storm god. Although this storm god gained supremacy in most of the cities where the northern peoples ruled, in Arena he remained in second place. But curiously enough, Hittite queens appear in several texts in a very close relationship to this Hattian sun goddess. They acted as her high priestess. Though there is no conclusive evidence to substantiate it, the existence of these texts suggests the possibility that the invaders, once martially conquering the land, may then have married Hattian priestesses to gain a more secure, legitimate right to the throne in the eyes of the conquered population. In the western sections of Anatolia, matrilineal descent and goddess worship continued into classical times. Strabo, shortly before the birth of Christ, wrote of northern Anatolian towns as far east as Armenia, where children who were born to unmarried women were legitimate and respectable. They simply took the name of their mothers, who, according to Strabo's reports, were some of the most noble and aristocratic of citizens. It is possible that at the time of the Hittite invasions, many of the goddess worshipping peoples may have fled to the west. The renowned temple of the goddess in the city of Ephesus was the target of the Apostle Paul's zealous missionary efforts in Acts 19, verse 27. This temple, which legend and classical reports claim was founded by the Amazons, was not completely closed down until AD 380. All along this western section, which included the areas known as Lycia, Lydia, and Caria, there were accounts in classical Greek and Roman literature of the widespread veneration of the mother of all deities, along with reports of women warriors, the Amazons. Diodorus wrote of a nation in this area in which women held the supreme power and royal authority. According to his reports, the queen of this land assigned the task of spinning wool and other domestic duties to the men, while law was established by the queen. He claimed that the rights to the throne belonged to the queen's daughter and succeeding women in the family line. It was in the land of Lydia that the legendary Indo-European Greek Hercules was said to have been kept as a servile lover to Queen Omphale. We may at this point question whether the numerous tales of Amazon women may not actually have been the latter Indo-European Greek accounts of the women who tried to defend the ancient goddess shrines and repel the patriarchal northern invaders. Yet we read in the Encyclopedia Britannica the only plausible explanation of the story of the Amazons is that it is a variety of the familiar tale of a distant land where everything is done the wrong way about. Thus, women fight, which is man's business. Throughout the classical Greek period, matrilineal descent and suggestions of matriarchy in Western Anatolia were repeatedly reported among the Lycians, where they appear to have lingered the longest or were most noted. Herodotus wrote, "Ask a Lycian who he is, and he answers by giving his own name, that of his mother, and so on in the female line." Nicholas of Damascus reported, "They named themselves after their mothers, and their possessions passed by inheritance to the daughters instead of the sons. Heracles Ponticus said of the Lycians, from of old they have been ruled by the women. Crete dominated by the female principle. Many classical authors wrote that the Lycians and the Carians had strong affinities with the island of Crete. Some claimed that Lycia had once been a colony of that thriving island culture. Upon Crete, goddess figures have been found in various Neolithic sites, though none as old as those on the mainland. On the Messara plain of Crete, the buildings known as tholoi, extremely similar to those of the Halaf site of Arpachaya, have also been discovered. From Neolithic periods until the Dorian invasion, Crete was the society that is most repeatedly thought to have been matrilineal and possibly matriarchal. There is a Crete in Illinois. The former director of the British School of Archaeology in Greece, Sinclair Hood, wrote in the Minoans, Crete in the Bronze Age. It seems likely enough that customs of the kind described as matriarchy or mother rule persisted in Crete. These arise in primitive societies where people do not comprehend when a baby is born who its father can be. The children are therefore named after the mothers, and all inheritance is through the female line. Primeval traditions of this kind survived in Western Anatolia into classical times. Thus, among the Carians on the west coast of Anatolia, succession was still through the mother in the 4th century BC, and in Lycia, to the southeast of Caria, children were named after their mothers. Charles Seltman wrote in 1952 of this highly developed culture of Crete, whose beginnings preceded biblical times by many centuries. He stated that upon Crete, matriarchy had been the way of life. He discussed the sexual freedom of women, matrilineal descent, and the role of the king, pointing out the high status of women in and around the land in which the goddess appears to have been the very core of existence. Among the Mediterraneans, wrote Steltman, as a general rule, society was built around the woman, even on the highest levels where descent was in the female line. A man became king or chieftain only by a formal marriage, and his daughter, not his son, succeeded so that the next chieftain was the youth who married his daughter. Until the northerners arrived, religion and custom were dominated by the female principle. In the Aegean civilization, Gustav Glotz, writing in 1925, examined the role of woman on Crete and asserted that women initially controlled the form and rites of the religion. He explains that the priestesses long presided over religious practices. Woman was the natural intermediary with divinities, the greatest of whom was woman deified. Host of objects represent the priestesses at their duties. The participation of men in the cult was, like the association of a god with a goddess, a late development. Their part in the religious ceremonies was a matter of concern and probably was quickly changing. Ishtar was revered as majestic queen whose decrees are preeminent. In one text, Ishtar herself says, when at a trial of judgment, I am present. A woman understanding the matter, I am. At Nimrod in northern Mesopotamia, I feel like I'm going backwards. Records of women judges and magistrates have been unearthed, testifying to the vital and respected position women held there even in the 8th century BC. In several cities, there were accounts of Babylonian priestesses who acted as oracular prophetesses, providing military and political advice to kings and leaders, revealing their powerful influence upon the affairs of state. Accounts of women scribes occur in all Babylonian periods, though there were more males in this field than women. We find in the laws of later Babylonia, which belong to sometime at the end of the second millennium, that a married woman might no longer engage in business unless it was directed by her husband, son, or brother in law. If anyone engaged in business with her, even if he insisted that he did not know she was married, he was to be prosecuted as a criminal. Mm, okay. Stylianus Alexo, director of the Archaeological Museum in Heraklion, writes in the chapter on the religion of Crete and Minoan civilization. The alabaster throne at Knossos was intended, according to Helga Rusch, for the priestess queen, who, flanked by griffins painted on the wall, personified the goddess. In the royal villa, the throne, which is set apart like a kind of sacred altar, shows that an actual person sat there to receive worship. According to Metz, when the queen descended the palace stairs to the courts within the shrines, she represented an authentic epiphany of the deity to the host of ecstatic worshippers. In 1958, Jaquetta Hawkes presented some perceptive observations on the status of women on Crete, commenting that although one may consider the possibility that the goddess may have been a masculine dream, Cretan men and women were everywhere accustomed to seeing a splendid goddess queening it over a small and suppliant male god, and this concept must surely have expressed some attitude present in the human society that accepted it. She continued by pointing out that the self confidence of women and their secure place in society was perhaps made evident by another characteristic. This is the fearless and natural emphasis on sexual life that ran through all religious expression and was made obvious in the provocative dress of both sexes and their easy mingling. A spirit best understood through its opposite, the total veiling and seclusion of Muslim women under a faith which even denied them a soul. In viewing the artifacts and murals at Knossos, the Archaeological Museum at Heraklion, and other museums on Crete, there is little doubt that the female divinity was for several millennia the principal sacred being on Crete, with women acting as her clergy. It is therefore interesting to follow the manifestations of the Cretan culture as they later developed in early Greece about 1,000 years before the classical Golden Age, about 500 to 200 BC, with which we are more familiar. Greece, the attack upon the matrilineal clans. The connections are made by the settlements on Crete and are or the mainland of Greece that are attributed to people known as the Mycenaeans, so named by archaeologists for one of the sites on the mainland. Mycenae. Clues to the origins of the people who inhabited these sites have presented scholars with some intriguing possibilities. Most believe that the Mycenaeans were a group of Indo Europeans, perhaps the same people as the Achaeans, or possibly those from an earlier migration of tribes from the north. Other scholars assert that they were already residents of Crete and that they overthrew the previous government shortly before 1400 BC. Some relate them to the group known as the Sea Peoples, while still others suggest that they were the Philistines or that the Philistines were a branch of the Mycenaeans. There has even been the suggestion that the Mycenaeans were related to the Hyksos, the shepherd kings, who used horse drawn war chariots and had previously held Egypt under their rule for several centuries. The Hyksos were driven out of Egypt at much the same time as the Mycenaeans first appeared. Whatever their initial origins, the reason that the Mycenaeans are important to us here is that their culture, as we best know it, was partially Cretan and partially Greek. Most scholars believe that they carried the Cretan culture from Crete to Greece. The linear B tablets of the Mycenaeans, which are inventory lists found at the Palace of Gnosis and all dated to the same year, about 1400 BC, used a language that scholars believed differed from those previously used on Crete. After many years of debate, most authorities accept that the language used on these tablets, written with many of the symbols and signs that had been used for an earlier language not yet acceptably deciphered, though Gordon has offered a body of evidence suggesting that it was closely related to the Canaanite language used in Ugarit, is an early form of Greek. If the Mycenaeans or their leaders were originally Indo European, as the tablets suggest, once they settled in Crete, they soon adopted much of the subject matter and the style of the craft techniques, the style of dress, the manner of writing, and the religion of the previous inhabitants of the island. Cottrell tells us that Mycenaean art continues to reflect the Minoan culture of the Mediterranean peoples, whose system of writing they had adopted. R.W. Hutchinson of the University of Cambridge writes that by the middle of the second millennium, probably, Greeks were already settling in Crete, but only in comparatively small numbers, and these Mycenaean Greeks had already adopted many Cretan cults and religious customs. Even on the mainland, we find survivals from Minoan or at least pre Hellenic religion. In the catalog of prehistoric collections of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, the curators point out in Mycenaean religion, where the adoption of many Cretan features is obvious, we may note above all the appearance of the Cretan nature goddess. In this vast museum is the collection of artifacts discovered in the excavations of the Mycenaean settlements on the mainland of Greece, a collection highlighted by the intricate craftsmanship of gold signet rings and seals that depict scenes of the goddess and her priestesses, scenes nearly identical with those produced in Minoan Crete. Discussing the Linear B tablets, in which the names of several deities later known in classical Greece are briefly mentioned. Cottrell explains there is also at Pylos on the mainland and at Knossos on Crete a frequent reference to Potnia, mistress, or Our Lady. These last inscriptions confirm what archaeologists had long suspected from the evidence on seals discovered on the mainland, that the Mycenaeans also worshipped the Minoan mother goddess. The Mycenaeans inhabited and ruled Crete at the Palace of Gnosis shortly before a major Holocaust, possibly caused by an invasion or earthquake. These same people also founded many pre-Greek cities on the mainland, and with them they brought the worship of the Cretan goddess. The Mycenaean age is generally placed between about 1450 and 1100 BC. Its beginnings date just before the period generally assigned to Moses. It thrived for centuries before the Greece of Homer, and it is likely that it was of events during or just after this period that Homer wrote. The quest for Helen may well have been the quest for the legal rights to the throne of Sparta. Although classical Greece is so often presented as the very foundation of our Western culture and civilization, it is interesting to realize that it actually came into being 25 centuries after the invention of writing and was itself formulated and deeply influenced by the Near Eastern cultures that had preceded it by thousands of years. Greece was invaded by northern peoples several times. Robert Graves, in his introduction to the Greek myths, wrote in 1955, Achaean invasions of the 13th century BC seriously weakened the matrilineal tradition. When the Dorians arrived, towards the close of the second millennium, patrilineal succession became the rule. With these northern people came the worship of the Indo European deus Pitar, literally Godfather, eventually known in Greece as Zeus and later in Rome as Jupiter. And now we have this, what's his name? Kevin Samuels, the Godfather, with his sweet self. This transitional period of the change from the worship of the goddess to the male deity, the change most intensively brought about by the Dorian invasions, was the subject of E. Butterworth's Some Traces of the Pre-Olympian World, written in 1966. Butterworth managed to accomplish with Greece what Murray had done with Egypt. By carefully tracing the lineage of the royal houses, he ultimately showed that many of the greatest pre Greek cities, which were essentially small nations, were originally matrilineal. He pointed out that Argos, Thebes, Tiryns, and Athens, as well as other cities, at one time followed matrilineal customs of descent. He explains that this was the result of the worship of the goddess and her Cretan origins, stating that Crete itself was matrilineal and possibly even matriarchal. His primary interest was in the patrilineal revolution, the time at which the patrilineal clans violently set about superimposing their customs upon all those around them. Matrilineality, though not universal in the Greek and Aegean world, was widely spread. The effect of the system of succession to the kingship and to the inheritance of property on the life of the times was immense. The majority of the clans were matrilineal by custom, and the greatest revolution in the history of early Greece was that by which the custom was changed from matrilineal to patrilineal succession and the loyalty to the clan destroyed. From 3000 BC onward, priestesses had been portrayed in sculptures and oh my stomach growling. They had been portrayed in sculptures and appeared in murals and other artifacts of Crete, strongly suggesting that it was women who controlled the worship. Crete was later ruled by the Mycenaeans, who then adopted their religion and many aspects of their culture. Since the religious artifacts of the Mycenaeans depict the clergy of the goddess as female, it is quite probable that the women in the Mycenaean communities of Greece also held this privilege. Butterworth asserted that it was the women, especially the women of the royal houses, who were the protectors of the religion. He further explains that the attack upon the matrilineal clans destroyed the power of the clan world itself and with it its religion. The history of the times is penetrated through and through with the clash of patrilineal and matrilineal as the old religious dynasties were broken, swept away, and reestablished. The matrilineal world was brought to an end by a number of murderous assaults upon the heart of that world, the Potnia Mater, or the great goddess herself. I cannot help but recall the Greek legend of the goddess known as Hera, whose worship appears to have survived from Mycenaean times, and her thwarted rebellion against her newly assigned husband Zeus, surely an allegorical reminder of those who struggled for the primacy of the goddess and lost. Yet, according to Hawkes, many of the attitudes about the lowly position of the women of classical Greece were greatly exaggerated by the bias of 19th century scholarship. She suggests that even in the classical period of Greece, women retained some of their Cretan predecessors' freedom. Just as in Crete, women shared the power of the goddess both psychologically and socially, priestesses were of high standing, and priestly associations of women were formed around temples and holy places. There was an influential one, for example, associated with the famous temple of Artemis or Diana at Ephesus. At this city, and indeed in Ionia, generally women and girls enjoyed much freedom, while women certainly won influence and responsibility by serving at the temples and great state festivals of the goddesses. There was also the liberation of the ancient cults. Respectable matrons and girls in large companies would spend whole nights on the bare hills in dances which stimulated ecstasy and intoxication, perhaps partly alcoholic, but mainly mystical. Husbands disapproved, but it is said did not like to interfere in religious matters. In the classical age of Sparta, where the veneration of the goddess as Artemis continued to thrive, women were extremely free and independent. According to both Euripides and Plutarch, young Spartan women were not to be found at home but in the gymnasia, where they tossed off their restricting clothing and wrestled naked with their male contemporaries. Women of Sparta appear to have had total sexual freedom, and through monogamy was said to be the official marriage rule. It was mentioned in several accounts that it was not taken very seriously. Plutarch reported that in Sparta, the infidelity of women was even somewhat glorified, while Nicholas of Damascus, perhaps as the result of some personal experience, tells us that a Spartan woman was entitled to have herself made pregnant by the handsomest man she could find, whether native or foreigner. Canaan, the social and legal position of an Israelite wife. I have saved the examination of the women in the two Hebrew nations of Judah and Israel for last, since we generally regard them as part of an isolated patriarchal society which worshiped the male deity alone. At this point, it will be clarifying to compare the position of Hebrew women not only with their contemporaries in Babylon and Egypt, cultures so intertwined with their own, but also with the other women of Canaan, where they finally settled. In the city of Ugarit in northern Canaan of the 14th century BC, which was not a Hebrew community, there are records of a woman whose title was translated as Important Lady of the Royal House. She was known as the Adath, Adith, Adath, meaning lady, as the female counterpart of Adon, meaning Lord. The goddess in this area was known as Anath, which may be the same word. The text of Ugarit, present day Ras Sharma in Syria, where legends of Anath were also unearthed, revealed that this important lady took an active part in political affairs. Claude Schaefer, co-director of the first excavation at Ugarit, wrote in 1939, "The social status of women, and particularly the mother of the family, thus appears to have been a high one in Ugarit." Ugaritan documents of this same period reveal that upon divorce or widowhood, a woman kept her own property. Legal records read much like those of Elam, stating that husbands left their possessions to their wives rather than their children. These children are told not to quarrel, but to respect and obey their mother. As I shall explain in the following two chapters, at Ugarit there was a curious combination of the southern and northern cultures reflected in their religious myths. There are accounts of many Europeans living in that city by the 14th century, yet the status of women does not appear to have been greatly affected by it at that time. Among the Ammonites of Canaan, a people with whom the Hebrews were in repeated conflict, women acted in official capacities. In 1961, archaeologist G. Lands wrote of the superior position of women being in agreement with nomadic practice. He states that women such as the Queen of Sheba, about 950 BC, at times led Arab states or tribes, and that this was also attested in the 8th and 7th centuries BC. In contrast to the economic, legal, and social position of women all about them, the position of the Israelite women exhibits the effects of the almost total acceptance of the male deity Yahweh and the patriarchal society that accompanied it. According to the Bible, though no archaeological evidence has yet been found to confirm it, the Israelite laws date from the time of Moses, about 1300 to 1250 BC. They continue as the law of the Hebrews of Canaan until the fall of the northern kingdom known as Israel in 722 BC and the fall of the southern kingdom known as Judah in 586 BC. These same laws still appear in the Old Testament of the Judeo-Christian Bible to this day. Through an extensive study of the Bible, archaeologist and priest Roland DeVoe made these observations about Hebrew women in his study of 1965, published as Ancient Israel. The social and legal position of an Israelite wife was inferior to the position a wife occupied in the great countries round about. All the texts show that Israelites wanted mainly sons to perpetuate the family line and fortune and to preserve the ancestral inheritance. A husband could divorce his wife. Women, on the other hand, could not ask for a divorce. The wife called her husband Baal or master. She also called him Adon or Lord. She addressed him, in fact, as a slave addressed his master or a subject, his king. The Decalogue includes a man's wife among his possessions. All her life she remains a minor. The wife does not inherit from her husband, nor daughters from their father, except when there is no male heir. A vow made by a girl or married woman needs to be valid, the consent of a father or husband, and if this consent is withheld, the vow is null and void. A man had the right to sell his daughter. Women were excluded from the succession. DeVoe asserted that, unlike all the other cultures of the Near East, there were no priestesses allowed in the Israelite faith. He explained that the suggestion that there were women among the clergy of the temple clashes with an important linguistic fact. There were priestesses in Assyria, priestesses and high priestesses in Phoenicia, where they are shown by the feminine of Kohen. In the Median inscriptions, there was a feminine known as Lua, priest, which some scholars would link with the Hebrew Lui, but Hebrew has no corresponding noun to Kohen or Lui. No women ever held a place among the Israelite clergy. I might add that according to Hebrew law, a woman had no right to money or property upon divorce, and since her vow was invalid, presumably she could not engage in business. Perhaps the most shocking laws of all were those that declared that a woman was to be stoned or burned to death for losing her virginity before marriage, a factor never before mentioned in other law codes of the Near East, and that upon being the victim of RAPE, a single woman was forced to marry the rapist. If she was already betrothed or married, she was to be stoned to death for having been RAPED. Perhaps the clearest explanation of the status of early Hebrew women was revealed by archaeologist D. Usishkin in 1970. He described an ancient Hebrew tomb recently unearthed in Israel in this way. Thus, it seems that one body, almost certainly that of the husband, was placed higher than the body of the wife, so that the woman's inferior status was also demonstrated after death. Despite the lowly position of women decreed by the Hebrew laws and customs, there were two incidents that reveal a possible revival of the ancient goddess religion even within the royal house of Israel. Their association with the ancient beliefs suggests that two queens may have gained power through the ancient matrilineal customs, which had perhaps slipped back into Israel along with other pagan patterns. Both incidents involved women who were listed as Hebrew queens, one in Israel and the other in Judah. The first concerns a woman known as Queen Maacah, possibly a descendant of an Aramaean princess of the same name, who was in the harem of Hebrew King David. This second Maacah was listed in the Bible as the queen of Rehoboam, king of Israel, from about 922 to 915 BC. His own mother was not Hebrew, but an Ammonite princess. This king is recorded as having erected pagan golden calves. Murray suggests that this same Queen Maacah was later the wife of the succeeding king Abijam, who is listed as the son of Maacah and Rehoboam. Her suggestion is based upon the fact that some versions of the Bible list Maacah as the mother of Abijam's son Asa. Other versions list Maacah as his grandmother, but place her name where the name of the mother would ordinarily be listed and never mention who his mother was, a pattern quite unlike all other descriptions of royal Hebrew sons. Murray wrote, the only way that Abijam and Asa could have had the same mother was by marriage of Abijam with his own mother. It's too much. It was Asa who brought about many Hebrew reforms, suppressing the then very prevalent heathen practices, and who finally had Maacah dethroned. In light of the curious discrepancies in Asa's genealogy, the reason given in the Bible for the dethronement is all the more interesting. In 1 Kings chapter 15, verses 2 through 14, we read that Maacah had made an Asherah, that is, a statue of the goddess Asherah. Considering the repeated evidence of paganism during this period, it seems quite likely that Israel had taken up the religious customs of old at that time, accepting the female religion and the female kinship succession to the throne. If this was so, then Maacah would have been the royal heiress and held this position until Asa, possibly under the influence of Hebrew priests, once again established the religion of Yahweh. The second incident is dated at about 842 BC, when Athaliah, the daughter of Queen Jezebel, claimed the throne of Judah as her own. According to Hebrew law, women were not allowed to reign alone, yet it required a violent revolution to dethrone her. Jezebel's parents, Athaliah's grandparents, were the high priestess and priest of Ashtaroth and Baal in the Canaanite city of Sidon, reigning there as king and queen. The murder of Jezebel, who had reigned alongside Ahab as queen in the northern kingdom of Israel, was actually a political assault upon the religion of the goddess. This made clear in the events that followed her murder in the biblical account in Kings 1 and 2. So it is worth noting that it was Jezebel's daughter who ascended to the royal throne of Judah, the only woman ever to rule the Hebrew nation alone. Most significant is the fact that once Athaliah secured her rights to the throne, she reigned for about 6 years, re-establishing the ancient pagan religion throughout the nation, much to the distress of the Hebrew priests. In summary, though Cause and effect between matrilineal descent, high female status, and the veneration of the goddess are often confused. We cannot avoid the fact that repeated evidence attests that the religion of the goddess and a female kinship system were closely intertwined in many parts of the Near East. Though much of the material pertains to royalty, there is enough to suggest that matrilineal customs were practiced in many areas by the general population as well. In examining the transition from the goddess religion to the worship of the male deity as supreme and the subsequent effects upon the status of women, we find certain patterns emerging. From the beginning of the second millennium, the Assyrians were in close political and commercial contact with the Indo European Hittites. Indo European Hurrian princes appeared in various cities of northern Syria from that same time on. By 1600 BC, Babylon was controlled by the Indo European led Kassites. By 1500 BC, Assyria was completely under the control of the Hurrians, who had formed the kingdom of Mitanni. Accompanying these conquests was the introduction of the myth of Marduk, who, we are told, murdered the goddess to gain his supreme position in Babylon. In Assyria, the same myth was told. The name of Asher simply substituted for the name of Marduk. Throughout the second millennium, the Indo Europeans made further inroads into the lands of Canaan and Mesopotamia, as I shall explain in the next two chapters, may have played an important role in the formation of the Hebrew religion and laws. It may be helpful at this point to summarize the changes in the laws as they affected various aspects of the lives of women. In Eshnunna in Sumer at about 2000 BC, if a man raped a woman, he was put to death. In the Old Babylonian period of Hammurabi, before the major incursions of the Indo Europeans, though many of the northerners were in Babylonia even at that time, the same punishment was given. In the laws of Assyria, which are dated between 1450 and 1250 BC, when Assyria was under Indo European control, we read that if a man rapes a woman, the husband or father of that woman should then rape his wife or daughter and or marry his own daughter to the rapist. The last part of the law was also the law of the Hebrews, who added that a raped woman must be put to death if she was already married or betrothed. Assyrian laws appear to be the first to mention abortion, assigning the penalty as death. The reforms of Urukagina about 2300 BC refer to the fact that women used to take two husbands, though at the time of his reign, this was no longer allowed. In the laws of Eshnunna, a man who took a second wife after his first had given birth to a child was to be expelled from the house without any possessions. In Eshnunna, if a woman had a child by another man while her husband was away at war, her husband was expected to take her back as his wife. No punishment for adultery was mentioned. In Hammurabi's laws, if a woman related to another man sexually, she was expected to take an oath at the temple and return home to her husband. The Assyrian and Hebrew laws give the husband the right to murder both the wife and lover. It is somewhat difficult to make comparisons between the various places and periods since the laws seem to have been included to codify very specific incidents and refer to varying situations. The major changes in the laws concerning women affected their right to engage in economic activities, what they might or might not inherit, what they in turn were allowed to pass on to their children, the attitude toward rape, abortion, infidelity on the part of the husband or wife, and among the Hebrews, only the penalty of death for women for the loss of virginity before marriage. These laws, since they primarily affected the economic and sexual activities of women, point to the likelihood that they were aimed at the matrilineal descent customs. The very fact that so many of the laws concerned women suggests that both the economic and sexual position of women was continually changing from the time of the first attested northern invasions about 2300 BC until the laws of the Hebrews, probably written down between 1250 and 1000 BC, though, as I mentioned, none of the original Hebrew texts have yet been discovered. In questioning to what extent the female kinship customs and the reverence of the female deity affected the status of women, we may perhaps best judge by our observations of the women of the Hebrew tribes who had accepted the worship of the new male deity alone and the subsequent laws controlling their position and rights in the society in which they lived. We might also want to consider the possibility that, in an even more personal way, just as the Hebrews prayed for sons and rejoiced when male heirs were born to carry on the family line, not so far removed from the attitudes of many families even today, in matrilineal societies, the birth of daughters was likely to have been considered a special blessing. Female children may have been especially cherished for the same reasons. According to the curators of the Archaeological Museum of the University of Cambridge in England, even today, among the matrilineal Asante in Africa, female children are especially valued because of their power to transmit blood, mogia, to continue the matriline, abusua. In ancient times, the sun goddess of Arena in Anatolia was worshipped along with her two daughters and a granddaughter. The Cassis of Assam worshipped their goddess along with her three daughters and a wayward son. What emotional effects this may have had upon the self-esteem and development of a young girl at that time, we can only guess. A consciousness of the relationship of the veneration of the goddess to the matrilineal descent of name, property, and the rights to the throne is vital in understanding the suppression of the goddess religion. As I shall explain, it was probably the underlying reason for the resentment of the worship of the goddess and all that it represented by the patriarchal invaders who arrived from the north. Judging by the continued presence of the goddess as supreme deity in the Neolithic and Chalcolithic societies of the Near and Middle East, goddess worship, probably accompanied by the matrilineal customs, appears to have existed without challenge for thousands of years. It is with it is upon the appearance of the invading northerners, who from all accounts had established patrilineal patriarchal customs and the worship of a supreme male deity sometime before their arrival in the goddess worshiping areas, that the greatest changes in religious beliefs and social customs appear to have taken place. Who were these northern people, and how were they able to gradually suppress and eventually destroy the ancient goddess religion that had existed for so many thousands of years? All right, so that is the end of chapter 3. I will include those in a list with the other ones that I've already done. I had to do this one over. So again, I do not agree with everything in the book. We are just going over the law. This is basically coinciding to why the earth will spew out the wicked. So we're going to talk about women being evil, as it pertains to goddess worship, and then men as it pertains to God worship. Where's the equality? Boys and girls, okay? We don't put our sons over our daughters or our daughters over our sons. All right. each child gets their own inheritance. So, again, thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Peace.